1. Not with a wand, nor lightly. The following ordinarily would appear in a foreword or preface. It is placed here on the assumption that most readers skip such preliminaries to get to the meat of the matter. In this case, the following is the crux of it all. The primary purposes for the release and publication of the material contained here are 1. That through dissemination as widely as possible, some other human being, perhaps just one, may be saved from the agony and terror of trial and error in an area where there have been no concrete answers, that he may have comfort in the knowledge that others have had the same experiences, that he will recognize in himself the phenomenon and thus avoid the trauma of psychotherapy, or at the worst, mental breakdown and commitment to a mental institution. And 2. That tomorrow or in the years to come, the formal, accepted sciences of our culture will expand their horizons, concepts, postulates, and research to open wide the avenues and doorways intimated herein to the great enrichment of man's knowledge and understanding of himself and his complete environment. If one or both of these aims are served, whenever and wherever it may be, this is sufficient reward indeed. The presentation of such material is not designed for any particular scientific group. Rather, the principal attempt is to be as specific as possible in language understandable to scientists and laymen alike, with avoidance of ambiguous generalities. The physicist, chemist, life scientist, psychiatrist, and philosopher may each use more technical or specialized terminology to state the same premise. Such interpretation is expected. It will indicate that the plan of communication is workable, that the plain talk does convey the proper meaning to a wide base rather than to a narrow pinnacle of specialists. It is expected, too, that many interpretations will be contradictory. The most difficult mental process of all is to consider objectively any concept which, if accepted as fact, will toss into discard a lifetime of training and experience. Yet much has already been accepted as fact on far less direct evidence than that presented here, and is now accepted. It is the hope that the same will apply to the data included here. It is indeed the most difficult mental process of all, this objective consideration business. Once in a lifetime is enough. Let's look for a beginning to this candid report of a highly personal experience. In the spring of 1958 I was living a reasonably normal life with a reasonably normal family. Because we appreciated nature and quiet, ours was a country environment. The only unorthodox activity was my experimentation with techniques of data learning during sleep, with myself as the chief subject. The first sign of deviation from the norm took place on a Sunday afternoon. While the rest of the family had gone to church, I conducted an experiment by listening to a particular tape recording in a highly isolated environment. It was a simple attempt to force concentration on a single intelligent signal source oral with lowered signal input from the other senses. Degree of retention and recall would indicate the success of the technique. Isolated from other sights and sounds, I listened to the tape. It contained no unusual or stray suggestion. Most significant in retrospect was the strong suggestion to remember and recall all that took place during the relaxation exercise. The tape ran its course with no unusual result. My recall was thorough and complete because it had been a product of my own efforts and thus familiar to me. Perhaps too much so, as no retention and recall of original or new material was possible in my case. The technique would have to be utilized with some other subject. When my family returned, we all had brunch, which consisted of scrambled eggs, bacon, and coffee. Some unimportant controversy occurred at the table, which was not germane to the problem. A little over an hour later, I was seized with a severe, iron-hard cramp which extended across my diaphragm or solar plexus area just under my rib cage. It was a solid band of unyielding ache. At first, I thought it was some form of food poisoning from brunch. In desperation, I forced myself to regurgitate, but my stomach was empty. Other members of my family who had eaten the same food showed no signs of illness or discomfort. I tried exercising and walking, on the assumption that it was a cramped abdominal muscle. It was not appendicitis, as my appendix had been removed. I could breathe properly in spite of the pain, and my heart appeared normal in pulse rate. There was no perspiration or other symptoms whatsoever, just the hard, tense, locked-in-place rigidity of a band of muscles in the upper abdomen. It occurred to me that perhaps some factor in the recording had caused it. In going over the tape and the written copy from which it had been made, I found nothing unusual. What suggestion there was, I complied with, seeking to relieve any unconscious suggestion that might have been applied. Still, no relief. Perhaps I should have phoned immediately for a doctor. However, it didn't seem that serious, nor did it become any worse. But it didn't get any better, either. Finally, we did phone for medical help. All of the local doctors were away or playing golf. From 1:30 in the afternoon until around midnight, the cramp and pain continued. No typical home medication seemed to alleviate it. Sometime after 12 I fell asleep from pure exhaustion. I woke up in the early morning, and the cramp and pain were gone. There was muscle soreness throughout the afflicted area, much as one gets from overcuffing, but no more. What caused the cramp in this area is still unknown. It is mentioned only because it was the first out of the ordinary event, physical or otherwise, that took place. In retrospect, perhaps it was the touch of a magic wand, or a sledgehammer, although I didn't know it at the time. Some 3 weeks later, the second major event entered the picture. There had been no further recorded tape experimentation, because the suspicion was strong that the cramp was somehow related. Thus there was nothing that apparently triggered the event. Again, it was a Sunday afternoon and the family had gone to church. I lay down on the couch in the living room for a short nap while the house was quiet. I had just become prone head to the north, if that had any meaning, when a beam or ray seemed to come out of the sky to the north at about a 30 degrees angle from the horizon. It was like being struck by a warm light. Only this was daylight and no beam was visible, if there truly was one. I thought it was sunlight at first, although this was impossible on the north side of the house. The effect when the beam struck my entire body was to cause it to shake violently or vibrate. I was utterly powerless to move. It was as if I were being held in a vice. Shocked and frightened, I forced myself to move. It was like pushing against invisible bonds. As I slowly sat upright on the couch, the shaking and vibration slowly faded away and I was able to move freely. I stood up and walked around. There had been no loss of consciousness that I was aware of, and the clock showed that only a few seconds had elapsed since I had stretched out on the couch. I had not closed my eyes, and had seen the room and heard outdoor noises during the entire episode. I looked out the window, especially to the north, although why and what I expected to see, I don't know. Everything looked normal and serene. I went outside for a walk to puzzle over this strange thing that had happened. Within the following 6 weeks, the same peculiar condition manifested itself 9 times. It occurred at different periods and locales, and the only common factor was that it began just after I had lain down for rest or sleep. Whenever it took place, I fought myself to a sitting position, and the shaking faded away. Although my body felt the shaking, I could see no visible evidence that it was doing so. My limited knowledge of medicine envisioned many possibilities as the cause. I thought of epilepsy, but I understood that epileptics had no memory or sensation in such seizures. Furthermore, I understood that epilepsy is hereditary and shows signs at an early age, and neither was evident in my case. In the next 4 or 5 occurrences of the vibration, I discovered little more. On one occasion, at least, it seemed to develop into a ring of sparks about 2 feet in diameter, with the axis of my body in the center of the ring. I could actually see this ring if I closed my eyes. The ring would start at the head and slowly sweep down to my toes and back to the head, keeping this up in a regular oscillation. The time of the cycle seemed to be some 5 seconds. As the ring passed over each section of my body, I could feel the vibrations like a band cutting through that section. When the ring passed over my head, a great roaring surged with it, and I felt the vibrations in my brain. I attempted to study this flaming electrical seeming ring, but could discover no reason for it, or what it was. All of this remained unknown to my wife and children. I could see no reason to worry or concern them until something definite was known of it. I did take a friend into my confidence, a well-known psychologist, Dr. Foster Bradshaw. If it had not been for him, I cannot predict where I would be at this time. Perhaps in an institution. I discussed the matter with him, and he was most interested. He suggested it might be some form of hallucination. Like Dr. Gordon, he knew me well. Consequently, he laughed at the concept that I was in the beginning stages of schizophrenia or the like. I asked him what he thought I should do. I shall always remember his answer. "Why, there's nothing else you can do but look into it and see what it is," Dr. Bradshaw replied. "Anyhow, it doesn't seem you have much choice. If it happened to me, I'd go off in the woods somewhere and keep trying until I found the answer." The difference was that it was happening to me and not to Dr. Bradshaw, and I couldn't afford to go off in the woods, either literally or figuratively. I had a family to support, among other things. Several months passed, and the vibration condition continued to occur. It almost became boring, until late one night when I was lying in bed just before sleep. The vibrations came and I wearily and patiently waited for them to pass away so I could go to sleep. As I lay there, my arm was draped over the right side of the bed, fingers just brushing the rug. Idly, I tried to move my fingers and found I could scratch the rug. Without thinking or realizing that I could move my fingers during the vibration, I pushed with the tips of my fingers against the rug. After a moment's resistance, my fingers seemed to penetrate the rug and touch the floor underneath. With mild curiosity, I pushed my hand down farther. My fingers went through the floor and there was the rough upper surface of the ceiling of the room below. I felt around, and there was a small triangular chip of wood, a bent nail, and some sawdust. Only mildly interested in this daydream sensation, I pushed my hand still deeper. It went through the first floor ceiling and I felt as if my whole arm was through the floor. My hand touched water. Without excitement, I splashed the water with my fingers. Suddenly, I became fully aware of the situation. I was wide awake. I could see the moonlit landscape through the window. I could feel myself lying on the bed, the covers over my body, the pillow under my head, my chest rising and falling as I breathed. The vibrations were still present, but to a lesser degree. Yet, impossibly, my hand was playing in a pool of water, and my arm felt as if it was stuck down through the floor. I was surely wide awake and the sensation was still there. How could I be awake in all other respects and still dream that my arm was stuck down through the floor? The vibrations started to fade, and for some reason I thought there was a connection between my arm stuck through the floor and their presence. If they faded away before I got my arm out, the floor might close in and I would lose an arm. Perhaps the vibrations had made a hole in the floor temporarily. I didn't stop to consider the how of it. I yanked my arm out of the floor, pulled it up on the bed, and the vibrations ended soon after. I got up, turned on the light, and looked at the spot beside the bed. There was no hole in the floor or rug. They were just as they always had been. I looked at my hand and arm, and even looked for the water on my hand. There was none, and my arm seemed perfectly normal. I looked about the room. My wife was sleeping quietly in the bed, nothing seemed amiss. I thought about the hallucination for a long time before I was able to calm down enough to sleep. The next day I considered actually cutting a hole in the floor to see if what I had felt was there on the subfloor, the triangular chip of wood, the bent nail, and the sawdust. At the time, I couldn't see disfiguring the floor because of a wild hallucination. I told Dr. Bradshaw of this episode, and he agreed that it was a rather convincing daydream. He was in favor of cutting the hole in the floor to find out what was there. He introduced me to Dr. Louis Wolberg, a psychiatrist of note. At a dinner party, I casually mentioned the vibration phenomenon to Dr. Wolberg. He was only politely interested, and evidently in no mood for business, for which I couldn't blame him. I didn't have the courage to ask him about the arm in the floor. It was becoming fairly confusing. My environment and personal experience had led me to expect some kind of answers or at least promising opinions from modern technology. I had an above-normal scientific, engineering, and medical background as a layman. Now, I was faced with something where answers or even extrapolation was not quickly available. In retrospect, I still cannot envisage having dropped the matter entirely at any time. It may be that I could not have done so if I tried. If I thought I faced incongruities at this point, it was because I did not know what was yet to come. Some 4 weeks later, when the vibrations came again, I was duly cautious about attempting to move an arm or leg. It was late at night, and I was lying in bed before sleep. My wife had fallen asleep beside me. There was a surge that seemed to be in my head, and quickly the condition spread through my body. It all seemed the same. As I lay there trying to decide how to analyze the thing in another way, I just happened to think how nice it would be to take a glider up and fly the next afternoon, my hobby at that time. Without considering any consequences, not knowing there would be any, I thought of the pleasure it would bring. After a moment, I became aware of something pressing against my shoulder. Half curious, I reached back and up to feel what it was. My hand encountered a smooth wall. I moved my hand along the wall the length of my arm and it continued smooth and unbroken. My senses fully alert, I tried to see in the dim light. It was a wall, and I was lying against it with my shoulder. I immediately reasoned that I had gone to sleep and fallen out of bed. I had never done so before, but all sorts of strange things were happening, and falling out of bed was quite possible. Then I looked again. Something was wrong. This wall had no windows, no furniture against it, no doors. It was not a wall in my bedroom. Yet somehow it was familiar. Identification came instantly. It wasn't a wall, it was the ceiling. I was floating against the ceiling, bouncing gently with any movement I made. I rolled in the air, startled, and looked down. There, in the dim light below me, was the bed. There were 2 figures lying in the bed. To the right was my wife. Beside her was someone else. Both seemed asleep. This was a strange dream, I thought. I was curious. Whom would I dream to be in bed with my wife? I looked more closely, and the shock was intense. I was the someone on the bed. My reaction was almost instantaneous. Here I was, there was my body. I was dying, this was death, and I wasn't ready to die. Somehow, the vibrations were killing me. Desperately, like a diver, I swooped down to my body and dove in. I then felt the bed and the covers, and when I opened my eyes, I was looking at the room from the perspective of my bed. What had happened? Had I truly almost died? My heart was beating rapidly, but not unusually so. I moved my arms and legs. Everything seemed normal. The vibrations had faded away. I got up and walked around the room, looked out the window, smoked a cigarette. It was a long time before I had the courage to return to bed, lie down, and try to sleep. The following week I returned to Dr. Gordon for another physical examination. I didn't tell him the reason for the visit, but he could see I was worried. He carefully examined me, ran blood tests, fluoroscopes, electrocardiograms, palpated all cavities, ran urinalysis, and about everything else he could think of. He checked very carefully for indications of brain lesions, and asked me many questions relating to motor action of various parts of the body. He arranged for an EEG brain wave analysis which evidently showed no unusual problem. At least he never reported any to me, and I am sure he would have. Dr. Gordon gave me some tranquilizers, and sent me home with orders to take off weight, smoke less, get more rest, and said that if I had a problem, it was not a physical one. I met with Dr. Bradshaw, my psychologist friend. He was even less helpful and far from sympathetic when I told him the story. He thought I should try to repeat the experience if I could. I told him I wasn't ready to die. "Oh, I don't think you'll do that," Dr. Bradshaw stated calmly. "Some of the fellows who practice yoga and those Eastern religions claim they can do it whenever they want to." I asked him, "Do what?" "Why, get out of the physical body for a while," he replied. "They claim they can go all over the place. You ought to try it." I told him that was ridiculous. Nobody can travel around without their physical body. "Well, I wouldn't be too sure," Dr. Bradshaw replied calmly. "You ought to read something about the Hindus. Did you study any philosophy in college?" I said I had, but there was nothing I could recall about this traveling without the body business. Maybe you didn't have the right philosophy professor, that's what it seems to me. Dr. Bradshaw lit a cigar, then looked at me. Well, don't be so closed-minded. Try it and find out. As my old philosophy professor said, if you're blind in one eye, turn your head, and if you're blind in both eyes, then open your ears and listen. Quote. I asked what to do if you were deaf, too, but I didn't get a reply. Of course, Dr. Bradshaw had every reason to be casual about it. It was happening to me, not him. I don't know what I would have done without his pragmatic approach and his wonderful sense of humor. It is a debt I shall never be able to repay. The vibrations came and went 6 more times before I got up the courage to try to repeat the experience. When I did, it was an anticlimax. With the vibrations in full force, I thought of floating upward, and I did. I smoothly floated up over the bed, and when I willed myself to stop, I did, floating in midair. It was not a bad feeling at all, but I was nervous about falling suddenly. After a few seconds I thought myself downward, and a moment later I felt myself in bed again with all normal physical senses fully operating. There had been no discontinuity in consciousness from the moment I lay down in bed until I got up after the vibrations faded. If it wasn't real, just a hallucination or dream, I was in trouble. I couldn't tell where wakefulness stopped and dreaming began. There are thousands of people in mental institutions who have just that problem. The second time I attempted to disassociate deliberately, I was successful. Again I went up to ceiling height. However, this time I experienced an overwhelmingly strong sexual drive and could think of nothing else. Embarrassed and irritated at myself because of my inability to control this tide of emotion, I returned back into my physical body. It wasn't until some 5 episodes later that I discovered the secret of such control. The evident importance of sexuality in the whole subject is so great that it is covered in detail later. At the time, it was an exasperating mental block which held me within the confines of the room where my physical body lay. With no other applicable terminology, I began to call the condition the second state, and the other, non-physical body we seem to possess the second body. So far this terminology fits as well as anything else. It wasn't until the first evidential experience which could be checked that I seriously considered these to be anything but daydreams, hallucinations, a neurotic aberration, the beginnings of schizophrenia, fantasies caused by self-hypnosis, or worse. That first evidential experience was indeed a sledgehammer blow. If I accepted the data as fact, it struck hard at nearly all of my life experience to that date, my training, my concepts, and my sense of values. Most of all, it shattered my faith in the totality and certainty of our culture's scientific knowledge. I was sure our scientists had all the answers. Or most of them. Conversely, if I rejected what was evident to me, if to no one else, then I would also be rejecting what I respected so greatly, that mankind's emancipation and upward struggle depends chiefly upon his translation of the unknown into the known, through the use of his intellect and the scientific principle. That was the dilemma. It may have been truly the touch of a magic wand and a gift bestowed. I still don't know. 2. Search and research. What does one do when faced with an unknown? Turn away and forget about it. In this case, 2 factors negated that possibility. One was nothing more than curiosity. The second, how can one forget or ignore an elephant in the living room? Or more to the point, a ghost in the bedroom? On the other side of the scale were the conflicts and anxieties, very real, very disturbing. There was no question that I was deeply afraid of what might happen to me if the condition continued. I was much more concerned about the possibility of a growing mental illness than a physical deterioration. I had studied enough psychology and had enough psychologist and psychiatrist friends to compound such fears. Moreover, I was afraid to discuss the matter with these friends. I was afraid that I would then be classified as their patients, and lose the closeness that equality, normalcy brings. Non-professional friends in business and community would be worse. I would be labeled a freak or psychotic, which could seriously affect my life and the lives of those close to me. Finally, it seemed to be something to keep from my family. It seemed unnecessary that they worry along with me. It was only the definite need to explain odd actions that forced the disclosure to my wife. She accepted it reluctantly because there was no other real choice, and thus she became a worried witness to incidents and events much in contradiction to her religious training. The children were then much too young to understand. Later, the matter became commonplace to them. Away at college, my older daughter reported that after she and her roommate had looked around the empty dorm room one night, she said, "Daddy, if you're here, I think you better go now. We want to get undressed for bed." Actually, I was 200 miles away at the time, both physically and otherwise. Gradually I became more accustomed to this strange addition in my life. More and more, I was slowly able to control its movements. In a few ways it had actually become helpful. I had become reluctant to part with it. The mystery of its very presence had aroused my curiosity. Even after I had determined that there was no physiological cause, and that I was no more insane than most of my fellow men, the fears persisted. It was a defect, illness, or deformity that had to be hidden from normal people. There was no one to talk to about the problem, other than an occasional meeting with Dr. Bradshaw. The only other solution seemed to be some form of psychotherapy. But a year or 5 or 10 of daily interviews costing thousands of dollars with no promised results didn't seem very efficient. It was very lonely in those early days. Finally, I began to experiment with this strange aberration, keeping notes of each event. I also began to read in areas of study long neglected in my life pattern. Religion had not greatly influenced my thinking, yet it seemed that this was the only remaining body of the writings and knowledge of man in which I could look for answers. Beyond childhood churchgoing and rare attendance with a friend, God and church and religion had meant little to me. In fact, I hadn't given the matter much thought one way or another, as it simply didn't evoke my interest. In my superficial reading of past and present Western philosophies and religions, I found vague references and generalities. Some seemed to fit as somebody's attempt to describe or explain similar incidents. Biblical and Christian writings offered many of these, all without specific causes or cures. The best advice seemed to be to pray, meditate, fast, go to church, absolve my sins, accept the Trinity, believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, resist evil, or resist not evil, and give myself to God. All of this did nothing but add to the conflict. If this new thing in my life was good, i.e., a gift, then it evidently belonged to saints, or at least saintly types, according to religious history. I felt that qualification for sainthood was certainly above and beyond me. If this new thing was evil, then it was the work of the devil, or, at the least, of a demon trying to possess or dispossess me, and should be exorcised. The Orthodox ministers of organized religion whom I met politely accepted the latter view to varying degrees. I got the feeling I was dangerous and heretical in their eyes. They were wary. In the Eastern religions I found more acceptance of the idea, as Dr. Bradshaw had indicated. There was much talk of the existence of a non-physical body. Again, such a condition of being was the product of great spiritual development. Only masters, gurus, and other long-trained holy men had the ability to leave their physical bodies temporarily to achieve indescribable mystical insights. There were no details, and no pragmatic explanation of what was meant by spiritual development. Implied was that in the practices of secret cults, sects, lamaseries, etc., such details were common knowledge. If this were true, what or who was I? Certainly too old to start life anew in a Tibetan monastery. The loneliness became acute. Evidently, there were no answers. Not in our culture. It was at this point that I discovered the existence of an underground in the United States. The only factor missing is that no laws exist against its function, nor is there official persecution and prosecution involved. This underground only occasionally intermingles in part with the worlds of business, science, politics, academia, and the so-called arts. Furthermore, it definitely is not limited to the United States, but infiltrates all of Western civilization. Many people may have heard of it vaguely or casually have come in contact with it, and passed it off as just people with queer ideas. For one thing is usually certain, members of this underground who are respected in their communities don't talk about the interest or beliefs that qualify them for membership unless they know you too are in the club. They have learned from experience that to be outspoken brings censure, from their ministers, customers, employers, or even friends. I suspect the membership may run into millions, if all would admit to their qualification. They are found in all walks of life: scientists, psychiatrists, physicians, housewives, college students, businessmen, teenagers, and at least a few ministers in formal religions. This group meets all the qualifications of an underground movement. They gather in small groups, quietly and often semi-secretly. The events are often publicly announced, but you have to be with it before you can understand the notice. The participants usually discuss affairs of the underground only with other members. Other than family or close friends, who are probably also members, the community doesn't know of this secret interest and life of the underground member. If you asked him, he would deny such membership because often he doesn't realize he really is so associated. All are to some degree emotionally and intellectually dedicated to a cause. Finally, the underground has its own literature, language, technology, and to some extent demigods. At the moment, this underground is highly disorganized. In fact, there is no organization whatsoever in the usual sense of the word. Rarely, even, have the local groups gone so far as to adopt a title or name for themselves. So far, they are simply small but regular gatherings held in someone's living room, or a bank's conference room, or quite possibly a church rectory. This group of individuals is groping in the dark and seems to take many diverse pathways, yet the goal is the same for all. However, like other kinds of underground movements, if you have become a member and you visit another city, you inevitably meet other members. It isn't planned. It just happens. Who comprises this underground? First, the professionals. At one end are the parapsychologists, very few in number. These are men who have legitimate doctorates from recognized universities, who have publicly conducted research into ESP. The most well-known of these is Dr. J. B. Rhine, formerly of Duke University, who conducted and compounded simple statistical probability card tests for some 30 years. To his satisfaction, he proved statistically that ESP is fact. His results are looked upon dubiously and for the most part unacceptably by the majority of psychologists and psychiatrists in the United States. There are others in the same category. Andrea Puharich, J. G. Pratt, Robert Krukal, Hornell Hart, Gardner Murphy all come under this classification. If you are a member, these are familiar names. The professional spectrum runs the gamut from the parapsychologist to the roadside palmist who claims to be a gypsy or New Delhi Indian, and who charges $5 for a quick 5-minute stock reading. Areas of interest are quite diverse, but all have interconnecting bonds of common beliefs in one way or another. The mass underground looks to the professionals for information and guidance, and gives them something akin to hero worship. Anyone who writes a book, organizes a foundation, conducts research, has a major experience, studied with a great professional, gives psychic readings, conducts classes in mind and/or soul development, heals by faith, is an accredited astrologer, minister of divine science or spiritualism, trance medium, outer space saucer devotee, hypnotist, these are the professionals. Most derive all or part of their income from this activity. Many have deep professional jealousy for each other, and often are inclined to be suspicious of techniques and theories propounded outside their particular activity. They may even subtly deride or look with tolerant, superior amusement at results unrelated to their specialty. This could well explain why, as of now, there is no organization in the underground. Yet, in spite of themselves, the professionals are drawn to one another. Their common interest forces this. There are no others with whom they can share their thoughts and experiences as equals and with understanding. This is not in any way intended to cast aspersions or discredit upon the professionals. They are a completely fascinating and wonderful group of people. Each in his own way, whatever it may be, is seeking after truth. What a dull world it would be without them once you have become a member of the underground. For the underground consumer, there are magazines, newspapers, lectures, book clubs. At least 50 new underground books are published each year, many by top houses, and even TV and radio programs. The latter, evidently put together by overeager members, have not been successful because the underground is still very much a minority group. The basic public reaction is, "You don't really believe in that stuff, do you?" Note by Anata Amara. Obviously this situation has changed. As we near the ascension. While I'm here I will testify that I have spent enough time in these realms to say he is reporting his experiences factually, and this is the fourth dimension. Who, then, makes up the mass of this underground? Contrary to what one might expect, they are not merely a conglomerate of silly, uneducated, superstitious, unreasoning misfits. True, some of the like are included, but at no greater percentage than is found in the general population. As a matter of fact, if it could be surveyed, it is quite probable that their average IQ would be far above that of a general cross-section of Western humanity. The common bond or cause that draws them together is simple. All have a belief that one man's inner self is neither understood nor fully expressed in our contemporary society, and two, this inner self has capabilities to act and perform mentally and materially to a degree unknown and unrecognized by modern science. These are people whose prime avocation is to read, talk, think, discuss, and participate in anything, psychic, or spiritual. This is all that is needed for membership. Perhaps you are in the club and didn't realize it. How do these people get that way? The most common answer is to experience or be a part of some phenomenon that cannot be explained by modern scientific, philosophic, or religious teachings. One type of person shrugs it off, sweeps it under the rug, and forgets about it. The other, who eventually becomes a member, tries to find some answers. I qualified for membership because I couldn't find any other source of information. Unfortunately, the information I was looking for was very sparse indeed, even in this strange new old world. But at least there were those who seriously considered the possibility that the second state could and did happen. It soon became apparent that the underground started more than 100 years ago, or earlier, when present-day science began to organize man's concepts and rid them of unreasoning, unsupported knowledge. In such efforts to purify, anything that did not or had not yet met the test of empiricism was ruthlessly discarded by intellectual leadership. Those who continued to hold any of the discarded beliefs fell into disrepute. If they stubbornly persisted and still wished to be active and accepted in society, they had no choice but to go underground with their secret ideas while maintaining another image publicly. Many who refused to practice this deceit became martyrs. To date, in this enlightened society, the same attitude still exists to a very great extent. Of the professionals who are known by their fellows as proponents of parapsychology or anything similar, there may be 5 who still command admiration and respect publicly from their profession, be it medicine, psychology, psychiatry, or the physical sciences. At this stage, I believe I have met all 5. Sadly, I am little wiser, through no fault of theirs. They just don't know much about the second state or second body. Most of all, I enjoy the people I have met in the underground. I've found them in small towns, big cities, in business, in church groups, in universities, and even in the American Psychiatric Association. As a rule, they are truly gentle people. They are jolly, with a warm sense of humor. They are a happy group who can laugh when necessary at their own serious interest. Whether intentionally or not, they are the most altruistic and empathetic cross-section of humanity I have known. It must be no accident that they are the most religious in the true sense of the word. If this appears to be a curt dismissal of all other sources and material uncovered in the psychic writings available, it is not so intended. Each has its own version of truth, and perhaps there are indeed many truths. I have sat in seances with trance mediums and asked definite questions, received vague answers which were to me pure evasions when a straightforward reply would have meant so much. Yet, later, to my astonishment, in one such case I participated in a second body experiment that verified, to me and others, the authenticity of this medium's ability. Truth here is truly a mystery. The work of Edgar Cayce, virtually a latter-day saint in the psychic world, was without doubt most evidential and well investigated, but unbelievable in terms of present-day science and medicine. Most definitely, here was truth unfolding, and history may not record it except in some dim archives. Today, some 20 years after his death, no more is known as to how his ability worked and what it was than on the day he died. Cayce's readings were helpful, but are exceedingly difficult to bring into concrete focus as they relate to second-state existence. He confirmed it, but did not explain. Much of his material in this area is clouded by the haze of a strong religious conditioning. This leaves it open to interpretation, so Cayce translators, ministers, have sprung up to provide such intercession. There are others even now who evidently can perform similarly to Cayce. One gave quite accurate physical reports of me, and provided some general data on my second-state activities which were neither enlightening nor provable. They did convince me of the validity of her ability, by all means. Again, another truth to me and others who participated, but no direct answers that could be used in a court of law. Several psychics performed life readings for me. They included wide generalizations, but were unable to give direct, straightforward answers to simple questions. Note by Anata Amara. What he is seeking. Material proof. Validation that can be upheld publicly, I have learned, is not allowed. It is beginning to be allowed now that the veil thins. This would violate the free will of the sleepers. As I have said many times, you may get the answers but don't expect to share it with anyone. If genuine, and who am I to say they are not? These psychics must be definitely limited in their specific perception. Either that, or they suffer problems in translation from symbols to articulation. I can well appreciate how this latter might occur. It was in my readings and contacts with this branch of human thought I fondly call the underground that I finally found strong glimmerings of what was happening to me. If I hadn't been involved personally, I would not have believed what I found. At the same time, it was comforting to discover that I was not unique. What was it all about? Simply, I was performing astral projection. Dr. Bradshaw had given me the clue, although he himself had heard about such things only remotely. Astral projection, to the uninitiated, is a term given to the technique of leaving one's physical body temporarily and moving about in a non-material or astral body. Many connotations have been given the word astral, and many interpretations, scientific and otherwise. The word scientific is used cautiously, because the modern scientific world, in the West, at least, neither recognizes nor is seriously aware of even the possibility of such things. In the obscure history of mankind, it is an entirely different matter. The word astral has dim origins in early mystical and occult events which involve witchcraft, sorcery, incantations, and other seeming foolishness which modern man looks upon as silly and superstitious nonsense. As no attempt was made to delve deeply into this area, I still don't know what the word astral means. Thus I prefer to stick to the terms second body and second state. This type of literature, which still flourishes, depicts an astral world composed of many levels or planes, which is where people go when they die. The person who travels around in his astral body can make short visits to these places, talk with dead people, participate in activities there, and come back to the physical body apparently none the worse for wear. There have been times when I have fervently prayed for the latter to be true. In order to perform this miraculous feat, one had to be arduously trained, or, better still, spiritually developed, according to the occultists. These teachings have supposedly been handed down secretly through history to enlighten those who had become advanced enough to receive them. Evidently, from time to time, there were those who revealed the secret or accidentally learned the technique. In the past, they have been canonized, castigated, cremated, laughed at, and locked up for such public revelation. This doesn't make the future seem very promising, in my case. Paradoxically, much of the data contained in my notes tends to confirm this occult approach to the subject, which came as quite a shock. Using liberal interpretation and translation into the modern idiom, much of it fell neatly into place. Also, much was left unsaid, although I do not know why. According to the literature of the psychic underground, the religious mystical history of man constantly makes reference to this second body. Long before Christianity and the Bible appeared, cultures in Egypt, India, and China, to name a few, held the second body idea as standard operating procedure. Historians have found these references again and again, but evidently consigned them to the mythology of the times. If one reads the Bible from this point of view, the belief is confirmed many times in both the Old and New Testaments. In the Catholic Church are found consistent reports of saints and other religious figures having such experiences, some of them willfully. Even in Protestantism, devout followers have reported the out-of-body experience during some form of religious ecstasy. In the Orient, the concept of a second body has long held a natural and accepted position of reality. Again, this is an entire study in itself, and there are numerous underground books and authorities on Oriental cultures that affirm the concept of a second body. There are supposed to be in existence today those adepts, lamas, monks, gurus, and the like who exercise mental and physical powers, including second body activity, that are completely at odds with present scientific knowledge. Largely, these have been ignored in our materialistic society because they can't be duplicated in the laboratory. In the files of various psychic research organizations here and abroad, there are hundreds of case history reports of out-of-body experiences. Such reports go back at least 100 years, and many more are found in various writings of the past. They are there for anyone who wishes to investigate the phenomenon. Virtually all of such reported experiences are spontaneous one-time only events. Usually, they have come at a time when the individual was either physically ill or debilitated, or during an intense emotional crisis. All seem to be highly subjective, yet the great mass of these reports is evidential in itself. During this century, several impressive collections of these experiences have been published and should be required reading if one pursues the subject. The weakness in all of them is apparent. Most are basically repertorial, supplemented by conjecture. No specifics based upon direct examination or experimentation are included. Reason: evidently, there has been no such solid research performed. In very rare instances there are published records of individuals who could deliberately and willfully induce the second state and move about in their second body. There may be more, but only two stand out in recent history. If others have and are performing this act, they have kept the results to themselves. The first of these is Oliver Fox, an Englishman who was active in psychic research and practices. He published fairly detailed reports of out-of-body experiences and techniques for achieving this state. Except in the underground of 1920, his work received little attention. Yet he very definitely attempted to bring the experience into the framework of understanding of his era. The second and most well-known was Sylvan Muldoon, who published several works on the subject in collaboration with Hereward Carrington, over the period 1938–51. Muldoon was the projectionist, and Carrington was a consistent researcher in psychic phenomena. To date, their books have been the classics in the field, and offer interesting reading. In my after-the-fact investigation, I again wondered at much that obviously had been omitted. Also, little or no empirical experimental tests were made to provide data for a serious yet objective investigator. The most recent has been a book by the author Iram. A Woman. Mary Backward. It too offered several clues, but no solid continuity relating to my case. Significant attempts at scientific study and evaluation have been made recently by several noteworthy men, such as Hornell Hart, Nander Fodor, Robert Krukal, and others with good academic backgrounds. Most of these are relatively free of the distorting factors present in so much of the underground literature, and their titles will be found along with other recent publications in the bibliography. All serve to verify the fact of the existence of the second body, but bring forth little or no concrete data at the experimental, non-philosophic level. Again, how can one discuss experiments that have not taken place? The most consistent problem encountered in associating with the underground has been to avoid submergence of the analytical approach in the vast morass of theological thought and belief. Once, not too long ago, man thought electricity was God, before that, the sun, lightning, and fire. Our sciences told us these ideas were ridiculous, and tried to show us through experimentation. Perhaps the second body operating in the second state can provide the quantum jump to prove God empirically. Then there will be no more underground. The psychic underground provided me with many new friends, but few specific answers to such questions as, what do I do now? To my surprise, they looked to me for answers. There appeared to be only one remaining path to take. Hundreds of experiments spread over 12 years, and still continuing, have brought forth conclusions that seem inescapable yet alien to my environmental conditioning. In the material to come, the test will be yours. 3. On the evidence. In the fall of 1964, an interesting meeting was held one evening in Los Angeles. It was composed of some 20 assorted psychiatrists, psychologists, scientists, et al., and myself. It was a most rewarding evening. The purpose of the meeting was to examine with sincerity and seriousness the experiences and experiments which have been condensed herein. After several hours of interrogation by the group, it was my turn. I asked two simple questions of each of them. If you were going through what I have been experiencing, what would you do? It was the definite opinion of the majority, more than 2/3, that every effort should be made to continue such experimentation in the hope of enlightening and expanding man's knowledge of himself. Several half-seriously stated that I should run, not walk, to the nearest psychiatrist. None present offered his services. The second question: would you, personally, take part in experiments that would lead to the creation of such unusual activity in yourself? Here, the pattern changed somewhat. About half stated their willingness to participate. Oddly, in this group were some of those who were most skeptical of the reality of such experiences. Of course, this gave me the opportunity to nudge gently those who were in favor of continued experiments. When it came to the dive into the cold, strange waters, let someone else do it. And in many ways, I don't blame them. If presented to me 12 years ago, I doubt that I would have volunteered. Why did the group bother to assemble? Curiosity, perhaps. Or again, it may have been some of the evidential material that had been accumulated. I hope the latter. Here are some of the key reports from the notes, which aroused their interest. The 10th of September 58 afternoon. Again, I floated upward, with the intent of visiting Dr. Bradshaw and his wife. Realizing that Dr. Bradshaw was ill in bed with a cold, I thought I would visit him in the bedroom, which was a room I had not seen in his house, and if I could describe it later, could thus document my visit. Again came the turning in air, the dive into the tunnel, and this time the sensation of going uphill. Dr. and Mrs. Bradshaw live in a house some 5 miles from my office, up a hill. I was over trees and there was a light sky above. Momentarily, I saw, in the sky, a figure of a rounded human form, seemingly dressed in robes and a headpiece on his head. An oriental concept remains, sitting, arms in lap, perhaps cross-legged a la Buddha, then it faded. I don't know the meaning of this. After a while, the uphill travel became difficult, and I had the feeling that the energy was leaving, and I felt I wouldn't make it. With this thought, an amazing thing happened. It felt precisely as if someone had placed a hand under each arm and lifted me. I felt a surge of lifting power, and I rushed quickly up the hill. Then I came upon Dr. and Mrs. Bradshaw. They were outside the house, and for a moment I was confused, as I had reached them before I got to the house. I didn't understand this because Dr. Bradshaw was supposed to be in bed. Dr. Bradshaw was dressed in light overcoat and hat, his wife in a dark coat and all dark clothes. They were coming toward me, so I stopped. They seemed in good spirits, and walked past me unseeing, in the direction of a smaller building, like a garage, Brad trailing behind as they walked. I floated around in front of them, waving, trying to get their attention without result. Then without turning his head, I thought I heard Dr. Bradshaw say to me, "Well, I see you don't need help anymore." Thinking I had made contact, I dove back into the ground and returned to the office, rotated into the body and opened my eyes. Everything was just as I had left it. The vibration was still present, but I felt I had enough for one day. Important aftermath: we phoned Dr. and Mrs. Bradshaw that evening. I made no statement other than to ask where they were between 4 and 5 that afternoon. My wife, upon hearing of the visit, said flatly it was not possible, could not be so because Dr. Bradshaw was home in bed sick. With Mrs. Bradshaw on the phone, I asked the simple question. She stated that roughly at 4:25 they were walking out of the house toward the garage. She was going to the post office, and Dr. Bradshaw had decided that perhaps some fresh air might help him, and had dressed and gone along. She knew the time by back-checking from the time they arrived at the post office, which was 20 minutes to 5. It takes roughly 15 minutes to drive to the post office from their house. I had come back from my trip to them at approximately 4:27. I asked what they were wearing. Mrs. Bradshaw stated she was wearing black slacks, and a red sweater which was covered with a black car coat. Dr. Bradshaw was wearing a light hat and a light-colored topcoat. However, neither saw me in any way or were aware of my presence. Dr. Bradshaw had no memory of saying anything to me. The great point is that I had expected to find him in bed, and didn't. The coincidences involved were too much. It was not important to prove this to anyone else. Only to me. It proves to me, truly for the first time, that there might well be more to this than normal science and psychology and psychiatry allow, more than an aberration, trauma, or hallucination, and I needed some form of proof more than anyone else, I am sure. It is a simple incident, but unforgettable. In this visit to Dr. Bradshaw and his wife, the time of visit coincides with the physical event. The autosuggestion hallucination factor is negative. I expected to find Dr. Bradshaw in bed in the house, but did not do so and was puzzled by the inconsistency. Identical reports with conditions of actual events. 1. Location of Dr. Bradshaw and his wife. 2. Position of the two relative to each other. 3. The actions of the two. 4. Wearing apparel of the two. Possibility of unconscious pre-knowledge through earlier observation of the above. 1. Negative, had no information of their change in plans or time habits of post office visits. 2. Indeterminate, consciously at least unaware of who walks first. 3. Negative, would have no pre-knowledge of their walking across to the garage in such fashion. 4. Indeterminate, may have observed both in similar dress, but expected to find only one, Dr. Bradshaw, in bedclothes. The 5th of March 59 morning. In a motel in Winston-Salem, I woke up early and went out to have breakfast at 7:30, then returned to my room about 8:30 and lay down. As I relaxed, the vibrations came and then an impression of movement. Shortly thereafter, I stopped, and the first thing I saw was a boy walking along and tossing a baseball in the air and catching it. A quick shift, and I saw a man trying to put something into the back seat of a car, a large sedan. The thing was an awkward-looking device that I interpreted to be a small car with wheels and electric motor. The man twisted and turned the device and finally got it into the back seat of the car and slammed the door. Another quick shift, and I was standing beside a table. There were people sitting around the table, and dishes covered it. One person was dealing what looked like large white playing cards around to the others at the table. I thought it strange to play cards at a table so covered with dishes, and wondered about the overlarge size and whiteness of the cards. Another quick shift, and I was over city streets, about 500 feet high, looking for home. Then I spotted the radio tower, and remembered that the motel was close to the tower, and almost instantly I was back in my body. I sat up and looked around. Everything seemed normal. Important aftermath. The same evening, I visited some friends, Mr. and Mrs. Agnew Bonson, at their home. They were partially aware of my activities, and on a sudden hunch, I knew the morning event had to do with them. I asked about their son, and they called him into the room and asked him what he was doing between 8:30 and 9 that morning. He said he was going to school. When asked more specifically what he was doing as he went, he said he was tossing his baseball in the air and catching it. Although I knew him well, I had no knowledge that the boy was interested in baseball, although this could be assumed. Next, I decided to speak about the loading of the car. Mr. Bonson was astounded. Exactly at that time, he told me, he was loading a Van de Graaff generator into the back seat of his car. The generator was a large, awkward device with wheels, an electric motor, and a platform. He showed me the device. It was eerie to see physically something you had observed only from the second body. Next, I told about the table and the large white cards. His wife was excited at this one. It seems that for the first time in 2 years, because they had all arisen late, she had brought the morning mail to the breakfast table and had passed out the letters to them as she sorted the mail. Large white playing cards. They were very excited over the event, and I am sure they were not humoring me. In this morning visit to Mr. Bonson and his family, the time of visit coincides with actual events. Autosuggestion hallucination, negative, no conscious intent of visit, although unconscious motivation possible. Identical reports with conditions of actual events. 1. Son walking down the street tossing ball in air. 2. Mr. Bonson at car. 3. Mr. Bonson's actions at car. 4. Device he had at car. 5. Action of Mrs. Bonson at table, the dealing of cards. 6. Card size and white color. 7. Dishes on table. Possibility of unconscious pre-knowledge through earlier observation of the above. 1. Negative, unaware of son's interest in baseball, and not conscious of his basic activities. 2. Negative, had no knowledge of Mr. Bonson's actions in morning around car, and reported action was not part of his daily routine. 3. Negative, as indicated such actions were not routine, i.e., loading of car, thus could not be part of pre-observed habit patterns of Mr. Bonson. 4. Indeterminate, possible that device had been observed previously but not in location indicated. 5. Negative, no part of pre-observation memory, as Mrs. Bonson did not make habit of such action, sorting mail at table was unusual event. 6. Negative, for reasons just given, coupled with no such habits in own life pattern of sorting mail at table, plus misinterpretation of action itself. 7. Indeterminate, pre-observation could have been applied here in relation to the Bonson family, as writer had taken breakfast there several times. The 12th of October 60 night. The results are so contradictory to what I believed that it must be reported in detail. In our attempts to find some answers, anywhere, we had come in contact with Mrs. M., who purportedly had mediumistic powers. I have and still have the highest regard for her as a person of great kindness and integrity. However, in 2 sittings, in which we participated, I came away with the definite impression that Mrs. M., although deeply sincere, was acting out some form of split personality when she went into a trance. The guides, who took over her body and spoke through her vocal cords, were to me nothing more or less than manifestations of this. This implied not that I thought Mrs. M. deliberately created this illusion, but that it happened as a result of a self-induced hypnotic state, and she truly had no knowledge of what took place. I was sure that in no way was Mrs. M. attempting to fake. She wasn't and isn't that type of person. What left me unconvinced was that when I had asked her guides, her dead husband and an American Indian, certain questions as they spoke through her, I received evasive replies. The best I could get was, "You will discover this through your own sources." This at the time seemed to me to be a simple way to avoid an answer that could be verified in other ways. It is important that I point out my complete skepticism of Mrs. M. and her guides. Yet what happened last night and the report today utterly confuses me. R.G., a friend of Mrs. M., had suggested that I attempt to visit a séance to be held by Mrs. M. in a New York apartment Friday night last night. I half agreed, stating that I certainly wasn't sure that it was possible. Frankly, when Friday night came, the meeting had slipped my mind consciously at least. Here is what took place. After a normal evening at home, my wife and I went up to bed around 11:30. My wife fell asleep almost immediately, as I could tell from her steady, deep breathing. As I lay there, evidently deeply relaxed and possibly half asleep, I suddenly felt that, walking over your grave, coldness in the hairs on the back of my neck started to rise. I looked across the half-darkened room, fearful yet utterly fascinated. I don't know what I expected, but standing in the doorway leading from the hall was a white ghost-like figure. It actually looked like the traditional figure of a ghost, some 6 feet tall as it stood there, with a flowing sheet-like material draping it from its head to the floor. One hand was reaching out and holding onto the door jamb. I was completely frightened, and I had no chance to connect the figure with anything I had done. The moment it began to move toward me, I cringed in half-terror and at the same time felt I had to see what it was. Almost immediately, I felt hands placed over my eyes so I couldn't see. I kept pulling the hands away in spite of my fear until finally the ghost-like form was beside the bed, not a foot away from me. Then someone took hold of my upper arms, gently, and I moved up out of the bed. With this, I calmed down, evidently because I felt that whatever it was friendly. I didn't struggle or resist. Immediately, there was a quick sense of movement and I then felt there were 2 of them, one on each side were suddenly over a small room, as if we were looking down on it from the ceiling. In the room below were 4 women. I looked at the 2 beings on each side of me. One was a blonde male, the other dark-haired, almost oriental. Both seemed to be quite young, in their early 20s. They were smiling at me. I spoke to them and said they would have to excuse my attitudes as I was uncertain of what I was doing. Then I floated down to the only empty chair and sat down in it. A tall, large woman in a dark suit sat opposite me. A woman in what looked like an ankle-length white robe sat next to me. The other 2 were indistinct. A woman's voice asked if I would remember that I had been there, and I assured her that I certainly would. Another woman said something about cancer, but that is all I could get. Then one of the women, the one in the dark suit, came over and swung over the side of my chair, and draped herself right on top of me. I didn't feel her weight, but for some reason, she got up suddenly. There was laughter, but my mind was on other things. Evidently, the contact with the woman who sat on top of me had altered things. Just at that moment, I heard a male voice said, "I think he's been away long enough, we'd better take him back." I was torn between going and staying, but didn't argue. Almost instantly, I was back lying in my bed and that was it, except that my wife had been awake during the entire time. She stated that I alternately gasped, made moaning and whimpering noises, and then seemed to do little or no breathing at all. Other than that, she hadn't seen or heard anything, except that our cat asleep in the room had awakened and had been extremely nervous. My wife was quite upset and worried. I'm sure I would have been too, if I had gone through the same with her. The meeting certainly deserved checking, so I phoned RG and discovered several things. First, there were 4 women at the séance. At my request, they were gathered together at the same apartment, very small living room, wearing the same clothes. The woman in the dark suit was of identical build as I saw, and she inadvertently sat in the chair reserved for me. This had taken place later in the evening, after 11:30, when the séance had been long over, and the 4 were sitting around talking. The tall woman had jumped up out of my chair when the rest called out, "Don't sit on Bob." They laughed at the joke. One of the other women had worn a long white housecoat. The words about my remembering were not spoken orally, that Superman communication again. But one of the women had stated she was working at Cancer Memorial Hospital the following day. I had met the other 2 women previously, Mrs. M and RG, but the 2 herein described were then strangers to me. 4 women, the clothes of 2, the build of 1, the sitting in the chair, the sitting on top of me and jumping up, the laughter, the small room, the cancer reference, that's too much coincidence even for me, and beyond my ability to hallucinate that properly. I'm convinced. But the 2 men. Does Mrs. M truly communicate with her dead husband and an Indian? I didn't know until afterward that he had been a blonde. I must be less of a skeptic and more open-minded with Mrs. M. In the visit to the apartment, time coincides with the physical event. Autosuggestion hallucination, indeterminate, as idea of trip may have been retained unconsciously, although no conscious attempt was made. Identical reports with conditions of actual events. 1. Size of room. 2. Number of women present, 4. 3. Empty chair. 4. Apparel of 2 women. 5. Cancer, mention. 6. Action of woman sitting in chair. 7. Laughter attitude of group. Possibility of unconscious pre-knowledge through earlier observation of the above. 1. Negative, no previous visits or descriptions of apartment. 2. Indeterminate, RG may have revealed number of people to be present. 3. Negative, idea of empty chair came to group only during that same evening. 4. Negative, had never met women before nor observed their dress. 5. Negative, for same reasons just given. Would have no knowledge of unknown woman's work at Cancer Memorial Hospital. 6. Negative, as action was unplanned. 7. Negative, as reaction of others was spontaneous. August 15, 63 afternoon. A productive experiment after a long layoff. R.W., a businesswoman whom I know quite well through long work association, and a close friend aware of my activities, but somewhat skeptical still, in spite of rather unwilling participation, has been away this week on her vacation up on the New Jersey coast. I do not know exactly where she is vacationing other than that. Nor did I inform her of any planned experiment, simply because I hadn't thought of it until today, Saturday. This afternoon, I lay down to renew experimentation, and decided I would make a strong effort to visit RW wherever she was. Rule 1 in my case always has been that I am most successful going to someone I know well, and the opportunity does not come up too often. I lay down in the bedroom about 3 in the afternoon, went into a relaxation pattern, felt the warmth, high-order vibrations, then thought heavily of the desire to go to RW. There was the familiar sensation of movement through a light blue blurred area, then I was in what seemed to be a kitchen. RW was seated in a chair to the right. She had a glass in her hand. She was looking to my left, where 2 girls about 17 or 18, one blonde and one brunette also were sitting, each with glasses in their hands, drinking something. The 3 of them were in conversation, but I could not hear what they were saying. I first approached the 2 girls, directly in front of them, but I could not attract their attention. I then turned to RW, and I asked if she knew I was there. "Oh yes, I know you are here," she replied mentally, or with that superconscious communication, as she was still in oral conversation with the 2 girls. I asked if she was sure that she would remember that I had been there. "Oh, I will definitely remember," the reply came. I said that this time I was going to make sure that she remembered. "I will remember, I'm sure I will," RW said, still in oral conversation simultaneously. I stated that I had to be sure she would remember, so I was going to pinch her. "Oh, you don't need to do that, I'll remember," RW said hastily. I said I had to be sure, so I reached over and tried to pinch her, gently, I thought. I pinched her in the side, just above the hips and below the rib cage. She let out a good loud, "ow," and I backed up, because I was somewhat surprised. I really hadn't expected to be able actually to pinch her. Satisfied that I had made some impression, at the least, I turned and left, thought of the physical, and was back almost immediately. I got up, physically, and went over to the typewriter where I am now. RW will not be back until Monday, and then I can determine if I made the contact, or if it was another unidentifiable miss. Time of return, 3:35. Important aftermath. It is Tuesday after the Saturday of the experiment. RW returned to work yesterday, and I asked her what she had been doing Saturday afternoon between 3 and 4. Knowing my reason for asking, she said she would have to think about it and let me know on Tuesday today. Here is what she reported today. On Saturday between 3 and 4 was the only time there was not a crowd of people in the beach cottage where she was staying. For the first time, she was alone with her niece, dark-haired, about 18, and the niece's friend, about the same age, blonde. They were in the kitchen dining area of the cottage from about 3:15 to 4, and she was having a drink, and the girls were having cokes. They were doing nothing but sitting and talking. I asked RW if she remembered anything else, and she said no. I questioned her more closely, but she could not remember anything more. Finally, in impatience, I asked her if she remembered the pinch. A look of complete astonishment crossed her face. "Was that you?" She stared at me for a moment, then went into the privacy of my office, turned, and lifted just slightly the edge of her sweater where it joined her skirt on her left side. There were 2 brown and blue marks at exactly the spot where I had pinched her. I was sitting there, talking to the girls, RW said, when all of a sudden I felt this terrible pinch. I must have jumped a foot. I thought my brother-in-law had come back and sneaked up behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I never had any idea it was you. It hurt. I apologized for pinching so hard, and she obtained from me a promise that if I tried any such thing again, I would try something other than a pinch that hard. In this episode, the time coincides with the actual events. Autosuggestion hallucination, indeterminate, as willful desire was suggested, and pre-knowledge was present a general location of RW at that time. Identical reports with conditions of actual events. 1. Location inside rather than outside. 2. Number of people present. 3. Description of girls. 4. Actions of people present. 5. The acknowledgement of pinching. 6. Physical marks from pinching. Possibility of unconscious pre-knowledge through earlier observation of the above. 1. Negative, pre-knowledge implied activity outdoors on beach rather than indoors. 2. Negative, pre-knowledge implied adults in group, as RW was visiting sister and brother-in-law. 3. Negative indeterminate, possibility of pre-knowledge of niece and hair color through RW sometime previously, negative as to friend of niece, her hair color and age. 4. Negative, no pre-knowledge of non-existent habit pattern for that particular moment of day. 5. Negative, RW had no pre-knowledge of experimental attempt as no such attempt had been made previously, nor was experimenter in habit of pinching RW had not done so previously. 6. Negative, no possible way that RW could have known where pinch marks should have occurred to conform with area reported. There are additional evidential reports, some of which have been included in other portions of this writing where they may help illustrate certain areas of theory and practice. 1 or 2 have been attempted under laboratory conditions. The incidents may have been simple and unimportant in themselves, but as minute pieces in a mosaic, they were vital. The emerging pattern through the glimpses of the whole was made believable and acceptable to me only through the inclusion of hundreds of such scraps of evidence. Perhaps it may be to you, too. 4. The here now. One of the most common questions that arises during any discussion of the second body and the second state is, where do you go? In evaluation of all experiments, there evolved what seemed to be 3 second state environments. The first of these was identified as locale I, for lack of a better nomenclature. More appropriately, it could be called the here now. Locale I is the most believable. It consists of people and places that actually do exist in the material, well-known world at the very moment of the experiment. It is the world represented to us by our physical senses which most of us are fairly sure does exist. Visits to locale I while in the second body should not contain strange beings, events, or places. Unfamiliar, perhaps, but not strange and unknown. If the latter is the case, then perception is distorted. Thus it is that the only evidential results provable by standard methods of confirmation have taken place while moving about via the second body in locale I. All of the experiments in Chapter 3 were made in locale I. Even so, these and others in the same category are pitifully few in proportion to all the recorded experiments. On the surface, it seems quite simple. Get out of the physical and into the second, then go visit George and make contact, come back into the physical and report. Nothing to it. If only it were that easy. Yet the factors present that make it difficult or recognizable. Recognition of a problem presumes an eventual solution one way or another, and perhaps it will be so in this field. Let us take first the factors of direction and identification. Suppose, for example, fully conscious and in your physical body, you were able to soar through the air rather than walk on the ground or ride in a car. You discovered this ability, and decided to fly over to George's house to demonstrate how it works. Your house or your laboratory is on the outskirts of a large city. George lives in a subdivision on the other side of town. On a sunny afternoon, you start off. Naturally, you rise high in the air so as to avoid obstacles of trees, buildings, etc. Uncertain, you don't go too high. You want to be able to recognize landmarks which might be difficult to see from 5,000 feet. Therefore, you stay low, about 100 feet off the ground. Now, which way to go? You look for points of familiarity. It is at that moment you realize you have a problem. You don't have a compass course to George's house, and it wouldn't do you any good if you did. You don't have a compass. Undaunted, you decide to cut across the city, using the familiar building and streets as guideposts. You have driven the route many times, so you should find your way easily. You start off over houses and streets, and almost immediately you become confused. The familiar has suddenly become unfamiliar. You look back, and you have difficulty finding your own house even at close range. It takes a moment to realize why this is so. You have been earthbound, and your entire point of view has been from a level of less than 6 feet. Most of the time, we habitually look straight ahead or downward. Only occasionally do we look up, when something attracts our attention. Even such an upward-looking angle of vision has little relationship to looking down from 100 feet. How long would it take for you to recognize your own home if you were shown a photograph taken from directly overhead? The same applies to all familiar surroundings, streets, buildings, cities, and people. You may get to George's house, but it will take you a long time. You may not identify it from a distance of 50 feet because you know only the appearance of the front of his house, and you approach it from the back. It is not a failing peculiar to you. Pilots of aircraft, their attention diverted for a moment, have become lost within 2 miles of the airport when flying at low level in bright daylight. For a moment, everything below is completely unfamiliar. Only navigational instruments can bring the quick orientation needed. It is easy to see how this problem can be compounded when your friend George lives in another city some distance away, where you have never visited, and when you have not seen pictures of the house. Of course, if he painted a fluorescent yellow X on the roof, with a 10 million candle power beacon of light, with similar markers on streets and highways along the route, you just might make it. Now let's take the same trip in the second body and examine it comparatively. Again, you are overhead 100 feet, floating in the air, this time with no physical body. It is a bright sunny day, but your seeing is somewhat impaired. You still are not fully accustomed to the technique of how you are seeing. As a result, your vision is distorted in one way or another. You can work your way slowly from over your home to George's house much as you would if in the physical body. It would be the same slow process under less favorable visual conditions. There is a better, faster way. Happily, there seem to be built-in directional senses if their use can be mastered. The if is the catch. As noted elsewhere, you think of the person at the end of your destination, never a place, but a person, and use the method prescribed. In a few moments, you are there. You can watch the landscape move under you if you wish, but it's a little disconcerting when you rush headlong toward a building or tree and go right through it. In order to avoid such traumas, forget about seeing during the traveling process. You never quite get over the physical body conditioning that such things are solid. At least I have not. I still have the tendency to move in the direction of the door to leave, only to realize again the situation when my second body hand goes through the doorknob. Irritated with myself, I then dive through the wall rather than the door to reinforce my awareness of the second state characteristics. In conjunction with this convenient homing instinct that is unaffected by distance, you are faced with a further problem, which is that the automatic navigational system is too accurate. It works by what and of whom you think. Let one small stray thought emerge dominantly for just 1 microsecond, and your course is deviated. Add to this the fact that your conscious mind may be in conflict with the superconscious as to what should be that destination, and you can begin to appreciate why so many experiments to produce locali evidential data have ended in failure. It sometimes causes one to ponder how there have been any such results when the difficulties are considered. As an experiment, try to concentrate for just 1 minute upon a single action or event or thing which you dislike, emotionally and intellectually, the superconscious expressing its will without the intrusion of any unrelated thought. It takes something more than practice, as you will discover. Here are some examples of misdirection, caused by an interrupting thought, taken from the notes. The 12th of April 63 late afternoon. Temp. 40s, humidity low, barometer high. Utilized countdown technique, warm sensation surged in on 31 count. Disassociated easily, under plan to visit a friend. Used stretch-out method, seemed to travel unusually long for 3-mile trip. Ellipsis. Then I stopped. I looked to see where I was, and found I was sitting on the edge of the roof of a 2-story house, with what seemed to be the backyard below me. There was a woman working in the yard, with a broom in her hand. As I watched, she turned to walk into the house. Just as she was about to enter, something made her look up directly at me. With a frightened start, she scuttled into the house, slamming the door. I felt that I should leave, embarrassed at having frightened the woman. I used the physical movement return signal, and came back easily, entering the physical without difficulty. Time away, 7 minutes, 10 seconds. Comment. Wonder what she saw sitting on the eave. Also, why this destination? Evidently concentration failure again. June 29, 60 late evening. Temp. 70s, humidity medium, barometer average, physically tired. Blood flow surge came at hold-off point before sleep, under plan to visit Dr. Andrea Puharich somewhere in California. Moved blindly for a short period, then stopped. 4 people were seated around a table, 3 men and a boy of about 11. Obviously not Dr. Puharich, in less unusual situation. I asked where they were, what was the location, town or state. There was no answer to my query, and I sensed wariness and caution on their parts. I asked again, and the boy turned and evidently was about to reply when one of the men said, "Don't tell him." Evidently, they were afraid of me for some reason. I apologized for my nervousness and explained I was still new to the non-physical business, turned, and left, not wishing to make them uncomfortable. Return to physical uneventful. Time away, 18 minutes. Comment. No connection with Dr. Puharich's activities at the time, as he reports. Wrong destination again, no validation possible. Why does my presence create such fear? This inability to control destination has been and still remains the chief barrier to the production of consistency and repeatability. The results of such attempts have brought many intrusions similar to the above, and many follow a similar pattern. Here is one that brought evidential data, although the persons involved were and are unaware of their participation. November 27, 62 morning. Temp. 40s, humidity medium, barometer below average, physically rested. Went into relaxation countdown, used sex center mental pattern with oral breathing to create condition. Used peel off to get out of body, just as if outer layer of physical were being removed, then free and floating in room. Plan was to go to Agnew Bonson. Started trip slowly to observe surroundings as much as possible. Went slowly through west wall, feeling texture of each layer of material in wall, then into another room, furnished as a living room, then into a third room, another living room, all unoccupied, and speed became faster. Nothing was visible but gray-black blur. Still concentrating on Mr. Bonson, finally stopped. Was in normal-sized room, bedroom, with 3 people in it. There was a large bed to the right, and 2 adults lay on it. A little girl, about 5 or 6, was sitting on the floor beside the bed, to the left of it. The little girl looked directly at me and said excitedly, "I know what you are." I turned to her, as gently and warmly as I could so as not to frighten her, and said, "You do." "Good. What am I?" She was not at all afraid when she said, "You're an astral projection." She may have used another term such as ghost, but it was definite understanding on her part, one way or another. I asked her where she lived and what year it was, but she couldn't give me an answer, so I turned to the two on the bed. I tried to be careful to avoid making them afraid or nervous, but it was obvious that they were. I asked them what year it was, but they didn't seem to understand no time concept in the superconscious. Closing parenthesis dot. I concentrated on the man, and asked his name and where he lived. He replied nervously. I moved away as he became more disturbed, and looked out the window for area identification. Outside the window was a small roof, such as over a porch. Beyond was a street, with many trees and a grassy island strip in the middle. There was a car parked at the curb, a dark-colored sedan. I sensed a need to return to the physical, and turned back to the three people. I asked if they would like to see me take off, and the little girl was eager, and the two adults appeared relieved. I used stretch technique, shot up through the ceiling, and returned to the physical without problems. Reason for recall: throat dry from oral breathing. Time away, 42 minutes. Comment: through a check by phone, I have located this family at the address which the man gave me. Would it be appropriate to visit them physically on some pretext? From this, it can be seen that a much more extensive and organized effort would be required for massive validation of second body activities in locale. One subject and several assorted scientists and psychiatrists are not enough. Also, it can be noted that unexpected visits to unprepared persons can't be helped at this stage of control. Perhaps much could be gained if such people could be interviewed as to what they saw and felt at the time of the intrusion. The difficulty lies in locating these people. It is the exception that enough data is obtained to identify the place visited, as in the above. Also, it is interesting when possible to determine the inconsistencies of observation of locale activities while in the second state. Except in unusual instances, most visual input registers in shadings of black and white. This seems true under any lighting conditions. However, strong light and shadow create wrong perceptions. For example, a strong light reflecting from the dark hair of a man brings the impression that he is blonde rather than dark. For example, from the notes. The 5th of May 61. Temp. 60s, humidity high, barometer medium, physically neutral. After dinner, early evening, in planned attempt to visit Dr. Puharik, used breathing jaw technique for relaxation, obtained vibration state after some difficulty via 90 degrees reach out technique. Applied simple mental lift out, and concentrated mental desire to visit Dr. Puharik. After short trip, stopped in room. There was a long narrow table, with several chairs, and bookshelves. There was a man sitting at the table, writing on paper. He resembled Dr. Puharik, but he was more light or blonde-haired. I greeted him, and he looked up and smiled, then stated that he would spend more time on our project, apologizing for being so neglectful. I said I understood, then felt uneasiness to return to the physical, and explained I had to leave. He stated that he realized my need for caution, and I turned and quickly headed back to the physical. Re-entered without difficulty, with right arm circulation down from lying on it awkwardly, which was evident reason for recall. Comment: in checking with Dr. Puharik, the locale was right, and actions were correct, but he has no memory of visit. Strong overhead light may have caused the reflection of blonde. The proceeding also illustrates the problem of communication. Dr. Puharik, awake and aware that specific attempts to visit him were being made, had no conscious recollection of any such meeting. All other factors checked accurately, except for the reported conversation. This has happened so frequently in such instances that it became the source of much discussion. At first, it was suggested that I was fantasizing these communications. It seemed probable that in so doing, I was merely calling upon my knowledge of the visitee, at the unconscious level, to create an authentic conversation. This theory received a setback when a number of such communications brought out data known only to the second party. Still another difficulty of locale travel lies in the time factor. Inconveniently, the best periods for deep relaxation so necessary to create the second state occur late at night. Therefore, it is quite natural to take advantage of such instances when possible. Less effort is required, and the separation is much more rapid. However, the physiological and psychological conditions that help induce the state are unpredictable and not known fully. This inconsistency brought numerous occasions when experimentation for purely evidential data ended in failure. The person to be visited was performing no reportable act other than lying in bed sound asleep. These were discounted completely as evidence. Most people perform this act every night. Similarly, attempts at validation during daylight hours brought their share of complications. With no promise of contact at a specific minute or hour, most people involved went about their normal affairs. Thus, when such visits were made, they were not necessarily discovered in a unique or unusual act or condition. As a result, the small, normally inconsequential acts observed during these visits often were but vague memories to the contactee when confirmation was needed. We have a great tendency to forget details of routine actions in life. You can prove this to yourself. Simply attempt to recall precisely in detail what you were doing at, say, 3:23 yesterday afternoon. If it was a routine task, chances are you will remember only the doing, if that much. Exact details will escape you. Yet the experimentation in visiting locali is extremely important, perhaps at the moment more so than anything else to be attempted. For only through evidential visits in locali can sufficient evidential data on the second body and the second state be obtained. Sufficient, that is, to bring about serious study by authoritative scientific groups of our time. Only through such concentrated and extensive study can a breakthrough of a revolutionary nature be obtained as regards the second body, and applied to the basic knowledge of man. Anything less, and it will remain an unsolved enigma at best, and at worst a ridiculed and unacceptable fantasy to both philosopher and scientist. For this reason, the recurring theme in the reports of experiments is, get evidential data. Here, then, is a later experiment in locali performed in the EEG laboratory of a hospital on a major university campus. Experiment #EEG-5. July 19, 1966. Arrived at the hospital EEG lab at 9 p.m., after driving 70 miles from Richmond. No particular sense of fatigue. Sleepiness earlier in the day, around 1 p.m., but no rest was taken. Active day from around 6:30 in the morning. By 9:30 in the evening, all electrodes had been attached by the technician, who was the only person present when I arrived. I reclined on a temporary cot, in a semi-darkened room, using a pillow and sheet, no shirt, but retaining trousers. Experienced usual difficulty in getting head comfortable, especially the ear pressed against the pillow. As a side sleeper, it made no difference which side, each was equally uncomfortable due to the electrodes attached to my ears. After a semblance of ease, I attempted to relax naturally, but was unsuccessful. I went finally into the fractional relaxation pattern count up from number 1, associating each number with a body part starting with feet, fixing closed eyes in direction of body part as number and mental command to relax were thought. Experienced usual mind drift at various points, and forced attention back to relaxation technique. Went through entire sequence without complete relaxation, so I started again at the beginning. After about 45 minutes of this without attaining full relaxation, I decided to take a break, sat up halfway and called to the technician. I sat up partially, smoked a cigarette, and talked with the technician for about 5 or 8 minutes, then decided to try again. After some time spent in attempting to ease ear electrode discomfort, concentrated on ear to numb it, with partial success. Then went into fractional relaxation technique again. Halfway through the second time around in the pattern, the sense of warmth appeared with full consciousness, or so it seemed remaining. I decided to try the roll out method, i.e., start to turn over gently, just as if you were turning over in bed using the physical body. I started to feel as if I were turning, and at first thought I truly was moving the physical body. I felt myself roll off the edge of the cot, and braced for the fall to the floor. When I didn't hit immediately, I knew that I had separated. I moved away from the physical, and through a darkened area, then came upon 2 men and a woman. The seeing wasn't too good, but got better as I came closer. The woman, tall, dark-haired, in her 40s, was sitting on a love seat or couch. Seated to the right of her was one man. In front of her, and slightly to her left, was the second man. They all were strangers to me, and were in conversation which I could not hear. I tried to get their attention, but could not. Finally, I reached over, and pinched the woman very gently. On her left side just below the rib cage. It seemed to get a reaction, but still no communication. I decided to return to the physical for orientation and start again. Back into the physical was achieved simply, by thought of return. Opened physical eyes, all was fine, swallowed to wet my dry throat, closed my eyes, let the warmth surge up, then used the same rollout technique. This time, I let myself float to the floor beside the cot. I fell slowly, and could feel myself passing through the various EEG wires on the way down. I touched the floor lightly, then could see the light coming through the open doorway to the outer EEG rooms. Careful to keep local, I went under the cot, keeping in slight touch with the floor, and floating in a horizontal position, fingertips touching the floor to keep in position. I went slowly through the doorway. I was looking for the technician, but could not find her. She was not in the room to the right, control console room, and I went out into the brightly lighted outer room. I looked in all directions, and suddenly, there she was. However, she was not alone. A man was with her, standing to her left as she faced me. I tried to attract her attention, and was almost immediately rewarded with a burst of warm joy and happiness that I had finally achieved the thing we had been working for. She was truly excited, and happily and excitedly embraced me. I responded, and only slight sexual overtones were present which I was nearly able to disregard. After a moment, I pulled back, and gently put my hands on her face, one on each cheek, and thanked her for her help. However, there was no direct intelligent objective communication with her other than the above. None was tried, as I was too excited at finally achieving the separation and staying local. I then turned to the man, who was about her height, with curly hair, some of which dropped over the side of his forehead. I tried to attract his attention, but was unable to do so. Again, reluctantly, I decided to pinch her gently, which I did. It did not evoke any response that I noticed. Feeling something calling for a return to the physical, I swung around and went through the door, and slipped easy back into the physical. Reason for discomfort: dry throat and throbbing ear. After checking to see that the integration was complete, that I felt normal in all parts of the body, I opened my eyes, sat up, and called to the technician. She came in, and I told her that I had made it finally, and that I had seen her, however, with a man. She replied that it was her husband. I asked if he was outside, and she replied that he was, that he came to stay with her during these late hours. I asked why I hadn't seen him before, and she replied that it was policy for no outsiders to see subjects or patients. I expressed the desire to meet him, to which she acceded. The technician removed the electrodes, and I went outside with her and met her husband. He was about her height, curly-haired, and after several conversational amenities, I left. I did not query the technician or her husband as to anything they saw, noticed, or felt. However, my impression was that he definitely was the man I had observed with her during the non-physical activity. My second impression was that she was not in the console room when I visited them, but in another room, standing up, with him. This may be hard to determine, if there is a firm rule that the technician is supposed always to stay at the console. If she can be convinced that the truth is more important in this case, perhaps this second aspect can be validated. The only supporting evidence other than what might have appeared on the EEG lies in the presence of the husband, of which I was unaware prior to the experiment. This latter fact can be verified by the technician. Important aftermath. In a report to Dr. Tart, the technician confirmed that she was in the outer hall with her husband at the time of the indicated separation. She also confirmed that I did not know he was present, and that I had not met him previously. Dr. Tart states that the EEG shows definite unusual and unique tracings during time of activity. 5. Infinity, eternity. The best introduction to Locale 2 is to suggest a room with a sign over the door saying, "Please check all physical concepts here." If getting accustomed to the idea of a second body was an uneasy experience, Locale 2 may be hard to take. It is certain to produce emotional effects as it steps solidly upon what we have accepted as reality. Furthermore, many of our religious doctrines and the interpretations thereof become open to question. It is enough to say that only a small part of the visits into Locale 2 via the second body has provided evidential data, for these visits do not easily lend themselves to proof. Therefore, much of the Locale 2 material is cautious extrapolation. However, several hundred experiments in this particular area have provided definite consistencies. If a plus b equals c 63 times, there is a high order of probability that a plus b will equal c the 64th time. Postulate: Locale 2 is a non-material environment with laws of motion and matter only remotely related to the physical world. It is an immensity whose bounds are unknown to this experimenter and has depth and dimension incomprehensible to the finite, conscious mind. In this vastness lie all of the aspects we attribute to heaven and hell, see Chapter 8, which are but part of Locale 2. It is inhabited, if that is the word, by entities with various degrees of intelligence with whom communication is possible. As noted in the percentile analysis in a later chapter, the fundamentals are altered in Locale 2. Time, by the standards of the physical world, is non-existent. There is a sequence of events, a past and a future, but no cyclical separation. Both continue to exist coterminously with now. Measurements, from microseconds to millennia, are useless. Other measurements may represent these factors in abstract calculation, but this is uncertain. Laws of conservation of energy, force field theories, wave mechanics, gravity, matter structure, all remain to be proved by those more versed in such fields. Superseding all appears to be one prime law. Locale 2 is a state of being where that which we label thought is the wellspring of existence. It is the vital creative force that produces energy, assembles matter into form, and provides channels of perception and communication. I suspect that the very self or soul in Locale 2 is no more than an organized vortex or warp in this fundamental. As you think, so you are. In this environment, no mechanical supplements are found. No cars, boats, airplanes, or rockets are needed for transportation. You think movement, and it is fact. No telephones, radio, television, and other communication aids have value. Communication is instantaneous. No farms, gardens, cattle ranches, processing plants, or retail outlets are in evidence. In all experimental visits, no food energy needs were indicated. How energy is replaced, if it is truly spent, is not known. Mere thought is the force that supplies any need or desire, and what you think is the matrix of your action, situation, and position in this greater reality. This is essentially the message that religion and philosophy have been attempting to convey throughout the ages, although perhaps less bluntly and often distorted. A facet learned in this medium of thought explains much. It is, like attracts like. I didn't realize there was such a rule that acted so specifically. It had been to me nothing more or less than an abstraction. Project this outward, and you begin to appreciate the infinite variations found in Locale 2. Your destination seems to be grounded completely within the framework of your innermost constant motivations, emotions, and desires. You may not consciously want to go there, but you have no choice. Your Superman soul is stronger and usually makes the decision for you. Like attracts like. The interesting aspect of this thought world or worlds of Locale 2 is that one does perceive what seems to be solid matter as well as artifacts common to the physical world. These are brought into existence, evidently, by three sources. First, they are the product of thought of those who once lived in the physical world, the patterns of which still remain. This is accomplished quite automatically, without deliberate intent. The second source is those who liked certain material things in the physical world, which they have recreated apparently to enhance their surroundings in Locale 2. The third source I assume to be a higher order of intelligent beings more aware of the Locale 2 environment than most inhabitants. Their purpose seems to be that of simulation of the physical environment, temporarily, at least, for the benefit of those just emerging from the physical world, after death. This is done to reduce trauma and shock for the newcomers by introducing familiar shapes and settings in the early conversion stages. By this time, one can begin to understand the relationship of the second body to Locale 2. Locale 2 is the natural environment of the second body. The principles involved in its action, composition, perception, and control all correspond to those in Locale 2. This, then, is why the majority of the experimental travel attempts took me involuntarily somewhere into Locale 2. The second body is basically not of this physical world. To apply it to visits to George's house or other physical destinations is like asking a diver to swim down to the ocean bed without scuba gear or pressure suit. He can do it, but not for long, and not too many times. On the other hand, he can walk a mile to the store daily without ill effects. Thus travel to points in the physical world is a forced process in the second body state. Given the opportunity of the slightest mental relaxation, the supermind will guide you in your second body into Locale 2. It is the natural thing to do. Our traditional concept of place suffers badly when applied to Locale 2. It seems to interpenetrate our physical world, yet spans limitless reaches beyond comprehension. Many theories have been offered in literature throughout the ages as to the where of it, but few appeal to the modern scientific mind. All of the experimental visits to this area have helped little to formulate a more acceptable theory. The most acceptable is the wave vibration concept, which presumes the existence of an infinity of worlds all operating at different frequencies, one of which is this physical world. Just as various wave frequencies in the electromagnetic spectrum can simultaneously occupy space, with a minimum of interaction, so might the world or worlds of Locale 2 be interspersed in our physical matter world. Except for rare or unusual conditions, our natural senses and our instruments which are extensions thereof are completely unable to perceive and report this potential. If we consider this premise, the where is answered neatly. Where is here. The history of man's sciences supports this premise. We had no idea that sounds existed beyond the range of human hearing until we developed instruments to detect, measure, and create them. Until comparatively recently, those who claimed they could hear what others could not were considered insane or persecuted as witches and sorcerers. We were able to perceive the electromagnetic spectrum only in terms of heat and light until the last century. We are still unaware of the capacity of the human brain, an electrochemical organism, in terms of transmission and reception of electromagnetic radiation. With this gap unbridged, it is easy to understand why modern science has not begun to consider the ability of the human mind to penetrate an area where no serious theory has been promulgated. There is so much to report on Locale 2 that it would be impractical to quote directly from the hundreds of referential pages of notes. Visits near and far in Locale 2 comprise most of the reporting throughout succeeding chapters. It is the summation of consistent experiences that may bring the pattern into focus and pose questions that plead for answers. For every known, there may be 1 million unknowns, but at least here is a starting point. In Locale 2, reality is composed of deepest desires and most frantic fears. Thought is action, and no hiding layers of conditioning or inhibition shield the inner you from others, where honesty is the best policy because there can be nothing less. Under the basic standards described above, existence is indeed different. It is this difference that creates the great problems of adjustment even when attempting to visit there while in the second body. The raw emotion so carefully repressed in our physical civilization is unleashed in full force. To say that it is overwhelming at first is a massive understatement in conscious physical life. This condition would be considered psychotic. My first visits to Locale 2 brought out all the repressed emotional patterns I even remotely considered I had, plus many I didn't know existed. They so dominated my actions that I returned completely abashed and embarrassed at their enormity and my inability to control them. Fear was the dominant theme, fear of the unknown, of strange beings, non-physical, of death, of God, of rule-breaking, of discovery, and of pain, to name only a few. Such fears were stronger than the sexual drive for union, which, as rioted elsewhere, was in itself a tremendous obstacle. One by one, painfully and laboriously, the exploding uncontrollable emotional patterns had to be harnessed. Until this was accomplished, no rational thought was possible. Without rigorous consistency, they begin to return. It is much like a slow learning from insanity to calm objective reasoning. An infant learns to be civilized in its growth through childhood to adult status. I suspect the same thing occurs all over again in the adaptation to locale 2. If it doesn't happen during physical life, it becomes the first order of business upon death. This implies that the areas of locale 2, nearest the physical world, in vibratory frequency, are peopled for the most part with insane or near-insane, emotionally driven beings. For the most part, this seems to be true. They include those alive but asleep or drugged and out in their second bodies, and quite probably those who are dead, but still emotionally driven. There is evidence to support the former, and the latter seems probable. This near area, quite understandably, is not a pleasant place to be. It is a level or plane where you belong, until you learn better. I don't know what happens to those who don't learn. Perhaps they stay there forever. The moment you disassociate from the physical via the second body, you are on the fringes of this close by section of locale 2. It is here that one meets all sorts of disjointed personalities and animate beings. If there is some protective mechanism for the neophyte, it was not apparent to me. Only by cautious and sometimes terrifying experimentation was I able to learn the art or trick of passing through the area. I still am not precisely sure of all items in this learning process, and so have presented only the obvious. Whatever the process, I happily have not encountered trouble in these passages for several years. Aside from the tormentors and the several outright conflicts noted in the following reports, the principal motivation of these near inhabitants is sexual release in all forms. If considered as the product of recent civilizations, including those both alive but sleeping, and dead, it is quite simple to understand the need for release from repression of this basic need. The key is that all those in this near section attempt sexuality in terms of the physical body. There is no recognition or knowledge of the sex drive as it is manifested in more distant parts of locale 2. With the lingering conditioning of our own society, it was difficult to avoid participation at times, as response was automatic. Hopefully, one learns to control this factor. Like attracts like. To date, I have not observed the death process in any experiments. However, the conclusion that some form of existence in locale 2 follows life activity in the known physical world goes beyond conjecture. Experiences similar to the following, consistent in content over the past 12 years, may be explained by some other concept. At this time, nothing else fits quite so neatly. On one occasion, I had just left the physical when I felt an urgent need to go somewhere. Yielding to the insistence, I moved what seemed to be a short distance and stopped suddenly in a bedroom. A boy was lying in the bed, alone. He seemed about 10 or 11 in age, and that now familiar inner identity perception was at work rather than just seeing. The boy was lonely and afraid, and seemed ill. I stayed with him for some time, trying to comfort him, and finally left when he had calmed down, promising I would return. The trip back to the physical was uneventful, and I had no idea where I had been. Several weeks later, I left the physical and was about to concentrate on a given destination when the same boy moved into view. He saw me and moved close to me. He was bewildered, but not afraid. He looked up at me and asked, "What do I do now?" I couldn't immediately think of how to reply, so I put my arm over his shoulder and gave him a comforting squeeze. I couldn't immediately think of how to reply, so I put my arm over his shoulder and gave him a comforting squeeze. I thought, who am I to instruct or give directions at what seemed a vital moment? The boy was reassured by my presence and relaxed. "Where do I go?" he asked it matter-of-factly. I said the only thing that seemed logical at the time. I told him to wait right where he was, that some friends of his would be along shortly, that they would take him where he was supposed to go. This seemed to satisfy him, and I kept my arm around him for a while. Then I became nervous with a signal from the physical body, and patted him on the shoulder and left. Returning to the physical, I found my neck stiffened from being in an awkward position. After straightening out, I succeeded in going into the second body again to look for the boy. He was gone, or at least I couldn't find him. An interesting sidelight. The next day the newspaper carried the story of the death of a 10-year-old boy after a lingering illness. He had died in the afternoon, shortly before I had begun the experiment. I tried to think of some acceptable excuse to approach his parents and get more confirmation, and perhaps relieve their grief, but could find none. Only when you have passed the raw emotion stage do you move into the innumerable various but evidently organized activity clusters of locale 2. It is impossible to convey to another the reality of this non-physical eternity. As stated by many in centuries past, it must be experienced. Most importantly, in many of the places visited, the inhabitants are still human. Different, in a changed environment, but still with human, understandable, attributes. On one visit, I ended up in a park-like surrounding, with carefully tended flowers, trees, and grass, much like a large mall with paths crisscrossing the area. There were benches along the paths, and there were hundreds of men and women strolling by, or sitting on the benches. Some were quite calm, others a little apprehensive, and many had a dazed or shocked look of disorientation. They appeared uncertain, unknowing of what to do or what was to take place next. Somehow I knew that this was a meeting place, where newly arrived waited for friends or relatives. From this place of meeting, these friends would take each newcomer to the proper place where he or she belonged. I could not think of any reason to stay longer. There was no one nearby I recognized, so I returned to the physical without incident. Another time I deliberately set out to explore in the hope of finding one answer to bring back. Upon disassociating into the second body, I started to move rapidly as I concentrated upon the thought, I wish to go where there are higher intelligences. I kept concentrating as I sped swiftly through a void that seemed endless. Finally, I stopped. I was in a narrow valley which seemed normal in all respects. There were men and women in ankle-length robes, dark in color. This time, I decided for some reason to take another tack. I approached several of the women, and asked them if they knew who I was. All were quite polite, and treated me with great respect, but gave negative answers. I turned away, and asked the same question of a man in a monk's robe who seemed hauntingly familiar. "Yes, I know you," the man replied. There was a strong sense of understanding and friendship in his attitude. I asked him if I truly knew who I was myself. He looked at me as if he had met an old and dear friend who now had amnesia. "You will." He smiled gently as he said it. I asked him if he knew who I had been last. I was trying to get him to say my name. "You were last a monk in Coshocton, Pennsylvania," he replied. I started to get uneasy, and apologetically left, returning to the physical. Recently, a Catholic priest friend took the trouble to investigate this possibility of past life monasticism. To my surprise and his delight, there is an obscure monastery near Coshocton. He has offered to take me there for a visit, but courage? Has not been available. Perhaps later. I could report many more of these experiences without fully describing the scope and dimension of Locale 2. There have been visits to a group that appeared to be in uniform, which operated highly technical equipment and identified themselves as the target army, the mind's interpretation of what was said. There were hundreds, each waiting for assignments. Their purpose was not disclosed. Another visit took me to a well-organized city, where my presence was immediately construed as hostile. Only by taking evasive action, running, hiding, and finally lifting straight up, was I able to avoid capture. I do not know what threat I implied to them. In a more direct fashion, the appearance of very aggressive actions tended to confirm again that Locale 2 is not solely a place of serenity and non-conflict. On another trip, I was accosted by a conventionally dressed man. Warily, I waited to see what he would do. "Do you know or remember Orozio Lafranco?" He asked the question bluntly. I replied that I did not, still cautious. I am sure you will remember if you think back, the man said firmly. There was a subtle demanding in his attitude which made me uneasy. I replied that I was sure I didn't remember anyone by that name. Do you know anyone at all down there? He asked. I had just said that I did not, when I suddenly went limp, and the man grabbed me. He took one of my arms, and I felt someone else take another, and they started to drag me in the direction of what seemed to be 3 bright spots of lights. I struggled, and finally broke loose when I remembered to use the go-to physical signal. I moved away rapidly, and after a short time was back in the office and into the physical. Evidently, hopefully, I had been mistaken for someone else. Still another trip had human attributes. I had arrived in no particular place, just a grayness, and was trying to decide what to do when a woman approached me. I am from the church, and I am here to help you, she said calmly. She came close, and I immediately sensed the female sexuality but held back as I didn't think the church intended this kind of help. I was wrong. After a bit, I thanked her and turned to see a man standing nearby, watching. He spoke in a strong voice, heavy with sarcasm. Well, now are you ready to learn the secrets of the universe? I masked my embarrassment by asking who he was. Albert Mather. He almost shouted it. I also got the impression that he was calling me by this name. I hope you're ready, he went on, his voice rising in anger, because nobody took the trouble to tell me when I was back there. I didn't hear the rest. It was as if a roar of static interfered. I moved away, not sure how his anger would vent itself, and returned to the physical uneventfully. In checking, I found no significant historical record of an Albert Mather, Longa, who seems to have no relation to the minister Cotton Mather of the 18th century. Other experiences in Locale 2 were more friendly, as indicated elsewhere. In most, there is no discernible pattern as to what attracted me to some of the strange situations. Perhaps this will come eventually. 2 unusual recurring conditions must be added to the coverage of this area. A number of times, the motion of travel, which is usually rapid and smooth, has been interrupted by what feels like a violent, hurricane-like gust in the spatiality through which one moves. It is as if you are being blown away by this uncontrolled force, tossed haphazardly around, end over end, like a leaf in a gale. It is impossible to move against this torrent or do anything but let it carry you. Finally, you are tossed near the edge of the current, and you drop out, unharmed. There is nothing to identify it, but it feels natural rather than artificially created. The second condition is the sign in the sky. I observed this on 5 or 6 occasions when escorted by the helpers. It is an incredible series of crude symbols strung in an arc directly across one section of Locale 2. When moving through the area, everyone has to go around this barrier, as it is solid, immovable, immutable. The symbols, as best my seeing could determine, were crude, stick-like illustrations of a man, an older woman, a house, and what looked to be algebraic equations. It was from one of the helpers that I learned the story of the sign. He told it with some humor, almost apologetically. It seems that an almost measureless time ago, a very wealthy, by what standards is not known, and powerful woman wanted to ensure that her son would get into heaven. A church offered to guarantee this to her, provided she paid the church a tremendous sum of money. The woman paid the church, but her son did not get into heaven. In anger and revenge, she used her entire remaining wealth and power to have the sign put up in the skies of heaven so that throughout all eternity, all who saw it would know of the dishonesty and rascality of that particular church. It was a job well done. The names of the woman, her son, and the church are lost in antiquity. But the sign remains, impervious to the efforts of scientists through the ages to bring it down or destroy it. The source of the apology and slight embarrassment is not the perfidy of some obscure sect, but the inability of anyone to take down the sign. As a result, all studies of science in this part of Locale 2 must necessarily include it. It would be much the same if someone artificially created an element between cobalt and copper. If you studied chemistry, by necessity you would have to include this odd element. Or, if a huge artificial moon were created and it was beyond our science to bring it down, students of astronomy would include it in their lessons as a common fact. That's the story as it was told to me. The greatest difficulty is the inability of the conscious mind, trained and conditioned in a physical world, to accept the existence of this infinite locale too. Our young Western mental sciences tend to deny its existence. Our religions affirm it in a broad, distorted abstraction. Accepted sciences contradict such a possibility, and can find no supporting evidence through their instruments of research and measurement. Most of all, there is the barrier. Why it exists is not truly known by anyone, at least in the Western world. This is the same screen that lowers when you awaken from sleep, blotting out your last dream, or the memory of your visit to Locale 2. This is not to imply that every dream is the product of a Locale 2 visit. But some of them may well be the translation of Locale 2 experiences. Translation, the symbolization of Locale 2 experience, is not necessarily part of the barrier. Rather, it would seem to be the effort of the conscious to interpret superconscious Locale 2 events which are beyond its ability to comprehend or pictorialize. Observation via second body in locale here now proved that the most ordinary functions or actions were subject to misinterpretation, especially when observed out of context. Locale 2, an environment totally unfamiliar to the conscious, offers that much greater margin for interpretive error. As can be inferred, I suspect that many, most, or all human beings visit Locale 2 at some time during the sleep state. Why such visits are necessary, I don't know. Perhaps one day, some year, our life sciences will unravel this knowledge and a new era will be born for mankind. With this will come an entire new science based upon Locale 2 data and our relationship to this wondrous world. Someday. If mankind can wait that long. 6. Reverse image. Paradoxically, the scientist today can conceive far more easily of the possibility of the area here labeled Locale 3 than that of Locale 2. Why? Because it fits his latest discoveries in physics, small bits of evidence he has uncovered in his experiments with matter bombardment, accelerators, cyclotrons, etc. The best way to get acquainted with Locale 3 is to take the significant experiments leading up to it directly from the notes. The 5th of November 58 afternoon. The vibrations came quickly and easily, and were not at all uncomfortable. When they were strong, I tried to lift out of the physical with no result. Whatever thought or combination I tried, I remained confined right where I was. I then remembered the rotating trick, which operates just as if you are turning over in bed. I started to turn, and recognized that my physical was not turning with me. I moved slowly, and after a moment I was face down, or in direct opposition to the placement of my physical body. The moment I reached this 180 degrees position out of phase, opposite polarity, there was a hole. That's the only way to describe it. To my senses, it seemed to be a hole in a wall which was about 2 feet thick and stretched endlessly in all directions in the vertical plane. The periphery of the hole was just precisely the shape of my physical body. I touched the wall, and it felt smooth and hard. The edges of the hole were relatively rough. All this touching done with the non-physical hands. Beyond, through the hole, was nothing but blackness. It was not the blackness of a dark room, but a feeling of infinite distance and space, as if I were looking through a window into distant space. I felt that if my vision were good enough I could probably see nearby stars and planets. My impression, therefore, was of deep, outer space, beyond the solar system, far in an incredible distance. I moved cautiously through the hole, holding onto its sides, and poked my head through carefully. Nothing. Nothing but blackness. No people, nothing material. I ducked back in hurriedly because of the utter strangeness. I rotated back 180 degrees, felt myself merge with the physical, and sat up. It was broad daylight, just as when I had left what seemed a few minutes before. Lapse time, 1 hour, 5 minutes. November 18, 58 night. The vibrations came in strong, but nothing more. Again, I thought to try the rotation. When I did, it worked, and I rotated slowly into the 180 degrees position. There was the wall and the hole and the blackness beyond, This time I was more cautious. Carefully, I reached a hand through into the blackness. I was astounded when a hand took mine and shook it. It felt like a human hand, normally warm to the touch. After the handshake, I withdrew my hand quickly. Slowly, I reached into the hole again. The hand shook mine again, and placed a card in it. I withdrew my hand and looked at the card. It gave a specific address. I returned the card through the hole, shook hands again, withdrew my hand, rotated back to normal, merged with the physical, and sat up. Most unusual. I will have to investigate this address on Broadway, if it is in New York. The 5th of December 58 morning. I rotated again, and again found the hole. Still with a note of caution, I approached the hole, and this time reached through with both hands. Instantly, both were grasped by two other hands. Then for the first time in all my experimentation, my name was called. A voice, feminine, soft, low-pitched, and urgent, just as if someone were trying to wake me up from sleep without startling me too much, called, "Bob." Bob. I was startled at first, then recovered and asked, "What is your name?" Always looking for evidential material. When I said these words, there seemed to be intense motion or activity, as if my words had created the effect of dropping a stone into a still lake or pond, like rippling, scurrying, crackling, etc. The voice repeated my name, and I repeated my question, still with the two hands holding mine. To be sure I was completely conscious that I was actually somehow saying the words correctly, I withdrew my hands, rotated in the 180 degrees, blended with the physical, sat up physically, and vocally spoke the question. Satisfied, I lay back, rotated, and called the question through the hole again. No answer. I kept trying, until I began to feel the vibrations weakening, and knew I couldn't hold the condition any longer. I then rotated back into the physical and normalcy. December 27, 58 night. Upon setting up the vibrations, I again found the hole as expected. I gathered up courage, and slowly poked my head through the hole. The moment I did, I heard a voice say in utter excitement and surprise, "Come here quick." Look. I could see no one. This could be due to my closed eyes conditioning in order to hold the vibration effect, i.e., physical seeing distracts. There was still blackness. The other party didn't seem to be coming, so the voice called again, urgently and excitedly. The vibrations seemed to be weakening, so I pulled back out of the hole and rotated back into the physical without incident. January 15, 59 afternoon. The vibrations came finally, and I rotated to examine the hole again. There it was, at 180 degrees. I was a little nervous when I reached through with one hand. Then I mentally smiled and relaxed, saying to myself, well, be it hand, claw, or paw, I'm friendly. With that a hand took mine and squeezed it, and I returned the grasp. I definitely sensed a feeling of friendliness from the other side. I returned to the physical by rotation after a little difficulty. In my excitement, I forgot both rotation and returned to normal signal. January 21, 59 night. As a preliminary, I tried the hole again. Rotation went smoothly after the vibration started, and I then reached one arm deep into the hole. When I reached in with the other arm, something sharp seemed to dig into the palm of my hand, like a hook, and dug in more deeply when I tried to withdraw it. I finally did so, somewhat shaken. It felt as if a hook had gone right through my hand. It was not necessarily painful, but the effect was disturbing. I rotated to the physical and looked at my right hand, physically. There were no marks or feeling, although the sensation of the penetration aftereffect was present. January 25, 59 night. Another hole experiment, with the same pattern of vibrations and 180 degrees. Again I carefully reached into the hole. A hand again took mine and held it firmly, no hook. Closing parenthesis dot. Then the hand passed mine over to a second hand. I slowly released the second hand and felt upward. There was definitely an arm attached to the hand, and a shoulder. I was about to explore more, when the vibration seemed to soften, and I pulled my arm back and rotated to the physical. There was no indication of the need to return to the physical, no cramped arms or legs, no noises. Probably a momentary sound caused the return. The 5th of February 59 afternoon. Perhaps my concern with the hole is justified. I follow the same approach pattern, vibrations and 180 degrees rotation, reached into the hole and at first felt nothing. I reached deeper, and suddenly it felt as if I had thrust my hand into electrically charged hot water. Most accurate description. I withdrew it very quickly, rotated, and sat up physically. The physical hand felt numb and tingling. From the position of my body, there was no evidence of poor circulation. The numbness and tingling slowly disappeared in about 20 minutes. February 15, 59 afternoon. I experimented with going in and out vertically, then rotated to the hole. Gathering courage, I pulled myself through in a sweeping rush, just as a swimmer might pull himself through a hole underwater. I felt the other side of the hole, and the wall was similar to my side. I tried to see, but there was still nothing but the deep blackness. I decided to settle the matter once and for all. I shoved away from the hole and performed the stretch out in a direction exactly on a line away from the hole. I started to move, slowly, and soon accelerated rapidly. I kept moving more rapidly, yet with only a slight sense of friction over my body. Moving at what seemed a very high speed, I went on, waiting and expecting to get somewhere. After what seemed a very long time, I began to be concerned. I still saw nothing, felt nothing. Finally, I began to get nervous. Fears about becoming lost began to creep in. I slowed, stopped, turned around, and stretched out back in the direction of the hole. It took just as long to get back as it did to go. I was quite worried when I finally saw the light through the hole up ahead. I dove for it, went through, rotated, and sat up physically. Time away was 3 hours, 15 minutes. February 23, 59 night. The hole is populated. This evening, 7:30, I went through vibration and 180 degrees rotation, and this time without much hesitation, I pulled myself through and stood up. I immediately felt myself in the presence of someone standing there. I sensed his presence rather than saw him. Impression, male. For some unaccountable reason that I do not yet understand, even recollected now in tranquility, I dropped thankfully in front of him and sobbed. After a moment, I calmed down, carefully backed away, went through the hole, rotated back into the physical, and sat up. Who was it? And why did I act so emotionally? February 27, 59 night. Determined to find some more or even one answers about the hole, I went through the vibration and 180 degrees rotation pattern, and deliberately went through. It was still black and dark, but not unpleasant, no hands, no presence. I could feel something solid under me, so I tried very hard to open my eyes and see. I did, and everything came into view. I was standing near a building more like a barn than a house on what was a wide, meadow-like area. I thought I would try to soar up into the sky, deep clear blue, no clouds, but I couldn't seem to get off the ground. Maybe I had weight here. There was what looked like a ladder 100 feet or so away, and I went to it and realized it was a tower of some kind, about 10 feet tall. Like a bird needing takeoff room, I climbed the tower to the top, leapt away in takeoff, and fell promptly to the ground with a solid thud. I guess I was surprised as a bird with clipped wings must feel. I got to my feet, and realized how foolishly I was acting. I was not following the proper procedures. Even here, they had to be followed. I held up my hands and arms in the stretch-out position, and went up easily. I moved slowly over the meadow, enjoying the view and exploration, when suddenly something flew past me. I turned just in time to see it heading for the wall and the hole. I was afraid for some reason that this was something that would go through and try to enter my body, so I wheeled in flight and dove for the hole. Too late, I realized that what I thought was the hole was a window in the side of the building, and then I was through the window and in blackness. I felt around in the dark, and there was the outline of the hole. I went through, rotated, and sat up in the physical. Everything looked normal, and I was in the right place. The time passage was okay, so back I went. Vibrations were still strong, so I rotated 180 degrees, went through the hole and out into brightness. More observant this trip, I noticed two people, a man and a woman, sitting in chairs near the outside of the building. I couldn't make contact with the man, but the woman, no physical identification other than this, seemed to know I was there. I asked her if she knew who I was, but I could get nothing other than a sense of awareness on her part. The vibration started to fade, so I backed away, dove into hole, rotated, and sat up. Total time of the entire episode was 40 minutes. What can be made of these experiments? Taken at face value, they add up at the least to an unusual hallucination. At most, the observations show a developmental pattern. First, there seems to be nothing in written history of such experiences as these to offer a comparison. These were not spontaneous incidents, but deliberately planned and systematically repeated. As such, they would appear to be unique. Second, the experiment was repeatable by formula: 1. The setting up of the vibration condition, followed by 2. A 180 degrees rotation, and 3. The appearance of the hole. The experiment was performed not once but at least 11 times. The 180 degrees rotation offers interesting speculation. The reference to out of phase and the apparent identical displacement in exact opposition deserves the attention of the physicist. Waveform studies of phase relationships applied in this case might provide a fruitful theory. The blackness of the hole was evidently a matter of my own limitation in seeing. Through the early experimentation, the restriction of vision was self-imposed, as I felt this was a requisite for maintaining the vibration condition. The evidence seems to point to this in the success in seeing when I decided or tried to see, and did. It would have been interesting indeed if I had utilized my vision during the long exploratory flight. Much might have been learned. The experience of the hands defies explanation. There is no evidence to indicate that I was conditioned or suggested into the first discovery of the hand. Second and later such experiences, however, could well have been of this source. But this in no way invalidates the first of these impressions. The card with the address might fall into the classification of past memories, associated with the handshake of a first meeting. Unexplained still is the digging of the hook into my hand. The calling of one's name is not uncommon under other circumstances. There are numerous records of such sourceless voices, both in the waking and sleep states. Various psychological theories have been formulated to explain the event, with partial success. Most interesting is the report concerning the evident discovery by some other party of my penetration through the hole. In accord with published reports of other experimenters, penetration of the hole was visible to a person or intelligence at some location other than the immediate vicinity. If this followed the pattern of other such reports, the time element would be identical. There is no means to verify this one way or another. My emotional reaction to the meeting with the someone had many of the aspects of a mystical experience. It is significant that I felt a sense of humble ecstasy which triggered an emotional release. That was the beginning. A series of experiments followed that were remarkable in their consistency of data and defied any historical explanation. The curious intellect cannot dismiss the collective experience as hallucination. Locale 3, in summary, proved to be a physical matter world almost identical to our own. The natural environment is the same. There are trees, houses, cities, people, artifacts, and all the appurtenances of a reasonably civilized society. There are homes, families, businesses, and people work for a living. There are roads on which vehicles travel. There are railroads and trains. Now for the almost. At first, the thought was that Locale 3 was no more than some part of our world unknown to me and those others concerned. It had all the appearances of being so. However, more careful study showed that it can be neither the present nor the past of our physical matter world. The scientific development is inconsistent. There are no electrical devices whatsoever. Electricity, electromagnetics, and anything so related are non-existent. No electric lights, telephones, radios, television, or electric power. No internal combustion, gasoline, or oil were found as power sources. Yet mechanical power is used. Careful examination of one of the locomotives that pulled a string of old-fashioned-looking passenger cars showed it to be driven by a steam engine. The cars appeared to be made of wood, the locomotive of metal, but of a different shape than our now obsolete types. The track gauge was much smaller than our standard track spacing, smaller than our narrow-gauge mountain railways. I observed the servicing of one of the locomotives in detail. Neither wood nor coal was used as a thermal source to produce steam. Instead, large vat-like containers were carefully slid from under the boiler, detached, and rolled by small cart into a building with massive thick walls. The containers had pipe-like protuberances extending from the top. Men working behind shields performed the removal, casually cautious, and did not relax their automatic vigilance until the containers were safely in the building and the door closed. The contents were hot, either through heat or radiation. The actions of the technicians all seemed to indicate the latter. The streets and roads are different, again principally in size. The lane on which vehicles travel is nearly twice as wide as ours. Their version of our automobile is much larger. Even the smallest has a single bench seat that will hold 5 to 6 people abreast. The standard unit has only one fixed seat, that of the driver. Others are much like living room chairs, placed around a compartment that measures some 15 by 20 feet. Wheels are used, but without inflated tires. Steering is done by a single horizontal bar. Motive power is contained somewhere in the rear. Their movement is not very fast, at something like 15 to 20 miles per hour. Traffic is not heavy. Self-powered vehicles exist in the form of a four-wheeled platform which is steered by the feet acting upon the front wheels. A mechanism pumped by the arms transfers the energy to the rear wheels, much like the children's rowing wagons of some years back. These are used for short distances. Habits and customs are not like ours. What little has been gleaned implies a historical background with different events, names, places, and dates. Yet, while the stage of man's evolution, the conscious mind translates the inhabitants as men, seems to be identical, technical and social evolution are not completely the same. The major discovery came soon after I gathered the courage for extended expeditions into Locale 3. In spite of early indications, the people there were not aware of my presence until I met and merged, temporarily and involuntarily, with one who can only be described as the I who lives there. The only explanation I can think of is that I, fully conscious of living and being here, was attracted to and began momentarily to inhabit the body of a person there, much like myself. When this took place, and it began to be an automatic process when I went to Locale 3, I simply took over his body. There was no awareness of his mental presence when I temporarily displaced him. My knowledge of him and his activities and his past came from his family and what was evidently his brain memory bank. Though I knew that I was not he, I could feel objectively the emotional patterns of his past. I have wondered what embarrassment I have caused him as a result of the periods of amnesia created by my intrusions. Some must have brought him much distress. Here is his life. At the first intrusion, was a rather lonely man. He was not particularly successful in his field, architect-contractor, and not too gregarious. He came of what might be classified as a low-income group, and succeeded in going to the equivalent of a minor college. He spent much of his early career in a large city in an ordinary job. He lived on the second floor of a rooming house, and took a bus to work. It was a strange city to him, and he made few friends. The bus, incidentally, was very wide, seating 8 abreast, and seats rose behind the driver in successively higher tiers, so that all could see the road ahead. My first intrusion caught him just as he was getting off the bus. The driver looked at him suspiciously when I tried to pay a fare. It seems that none is charged. The next intrusion came at an emotional crisis. There met Lee, a wealthy young woman with 2 children, a boy and a girl, both under 4 years of age. Lee was a sad, wistful, and somewhat preoccupied person, who seemed to have experienced some major tragedy in her life. This had some relationship to her former husband, but was not clear. There met her quite accidentally, and was deeply attracted to her. The 2 children found in him a great companion. Lee appeared only mildly interested at this first meeting. Her greatest response lay in his attention to and warmth for the children. A short time later an intrusion occurred just as Lee and I there had announced to friends, her friends, that they were going to be married. This has a slightly different connotation. There was much consternation among the friends, chiefly due to the fact that it had been only 30 days since some major event had occurred in Lee's life: divorce, her husband's death, or some physical debilitation. There was still greatly attracted, and Lee was still sad and introspective. A later intrusion came when Lee and there were living in a house in a semi-pastoral surrounding. The house sat on a low hill, had long rectangular windows, and very wide eaves much like those of a pagoda. The railroad curved around the hill some 300 yards in the distance, the tracks coming in from the right in a straight line, then across the front of the hill, then around to the back and to the left. There was deep green grass from the steps of the house, down over the roll of the hill. Behind the house, there had an office, a one-room building where he worked. On this occasion, Lee entered the office and came over to the desk just as I had replaced there. "The workmen want to borrow some of your tools," she said. I looked at her blankly. I was not sure what to say, so I asked her what workmen. "The men working on the road, of course." She had not yet sensed anything wrong. Before I realized what effect it would have, I said there were no men working on the road. With this, she looked at me intently, with a growing suspicion. I was thoroughly unsure of what to do next, so I left his body and returned through the hole. Another eventful intrusion came when there had set up his laboratory. He was not fully qualified to perform research, but he had decided he could make some kind of new discoveries. He had, perhaps with the assistance of Lee's wealth, taken a huge storage building, divided it internally into small rooms, and was conducting some kind of experiments. In the middle of one, I displaced him in his body, but was unable to calculate what was next in his routine. Just then, Lee came in, with visitors, principally to show the kind of work he had achieved in the renovated building. There's body stood there unable to speak when Lee asked me to tell them of the work I had been doing. Somewhat embarrassed, Lee led the couple out into another room. I hesitated when perhaps there would have followed. I tried to feel any pattern of activity that he might have been doing. The best I could get was that he had been trying to develop new forms of theatrical entertainment, designing theater stages, lighting, and sets, all in an attempt to make watching a play a strongly subjective experience. With only this partial success in his recall, I left his body when I heard them returning so as to avoid further complicating his life. A vacation in the mountains was underway at another intrusion point. Lee, and the two children were riding along a winding mountain road, each on the self-propelled vehicle described elsewhere. I took over, inadvertently just as they were reaching the bottom of one hill and had started up another. New to the device, I tried to make it go up the next hill, and soon rolled off the road and into a small pile of dirt. The rest waited while I tried to get back on the road, and I muttered that there were better ways to get around than this. This triggered something in Lee, and she suddenly became quiet. Why, I didn't know. I'm sure, there did. I tried to tell her that I was not who she thought, then realized that this was only making it worse. I left, returning to the hole and the physical body. In later intrusions, there and Lee no longer lived together. He had met with some success, but some action of his alienated her. Alone, he has thought of her constantly, and deeply regretted the weakness that made him displease her. He met her casually once, in a large city, and pleaded with her to let him visit her. She told him she would let him do so, and see how things worked out. She lived in the equivalent of an apartment, on the third floor of a residential building. He promised to come. Unfortunately, there lost or forgot the address she gave him, and at the last intrusion, was a lonely and frustrated man. He was sure that Lee would interpret his loss of the address as indifference on his part and another example of his instability. He was working, but was spending his idle time trying to find Lee and the children. What can be made of all this? In view of the less than idyllic circumstances, it scarcely qualifies as an escape from reality via the unconscious. Nor is it the type of life one might select to enjoy vicariously. One can only speculate, and such speculation of itself must consider concepts unacceptable to present-day science. However, the dual but different life activity may lend a clue to the where of locale 3. The most important assumption is that locale 3 and locale I here now are not the same. This is based upon the differences in scientific development. Locale 3 is not more advanced, perhaps even less so. There is no time in our known history where science was at the locale 3 stage. If locale 3 is neither the known past nor the present, and not the probable future of locale I, what is it? It is not a part of locale 2, where only thought is needed or used. It might be a memory, racial or otherwise, of a physical Earth civilization that predates known history. It might be another Earth-type world located in another part of the universe which is somehow accessible through mental manipulation. It might be an antimatter duplicate of this physical Earth world where we are the same but different, bonded together unit for unit by a force beyond our present comprehension. Dr. Leon M. Lederman, professor of physics at Columbia University, has stated, "Basic physics is completely consistent with the cosmological conception of a literal antiworld of stars and planets composed of atoms of antimatter, which is to say negative nuclei surrounded by positive electrons. We can now entertain the intriguing idea that these antiworlds are populated by antipeople, whose antiscientists are perhaps even now excited by the discovery of matter." 7. Post-mortem. Any acknowledgement of the existence of the second body immediately demands the question mankind has pondered since the day he learned to think: do we live on? Is there life beyond the grave? Our religions say believe, have faith. This is not quite enough for the syllogistic thinker who seeks valid premises that are clear-cut, leading to an inescapable conclusion. All I can do is be as repertorial and objective as one can be in a basically subjective experience. Perhaps my premises will be valid to you as you read them. I first met Dr. Richard Gordon in 1942, in New York. He was an MD, a specialist in internal medicine. We became friends, and he became our family doctor. He had a very successful practice, built up over the years, and possessed a rare cynical sarcastic sense of humor. He was a down-to-earth realist with the wisdom of experience. He was in his 50s when we first met, so I never knew him as a young man. He was short and thin, with straight white hair, tending to baldness. Dr. Gordon had two conspicuous mannerisms. He had decided to live a long time, evidently, and so paced himself very carefully. He walked deliberately in a slow, careful stride. He hurried only when absolutely necessary. More correctly, he strolled when he walked, with studied casualness. Second, when someone visited him in his office, he would glance out from the inner doorway and stare intently. He didn't say, hello, or nod or wave. He simply stared as if he were saying, now what in hell's the matter with him? Without ever having spoken of it, Dr. Gordon and I had a very warm and close rapport. It was one of those things that happen without explanation, with no logical reason. We had not too much in common, other than the fact of going through a life experience at nearly the same moment in history. In the spring of 1961 I visited Dr. Gordon at his office and had lunch with him there, cooked over a Bunsen burner by his longtime nurse. He looked tired and preoccupied and I commented about it. "I haven't been feeling too well," he replied, and then flared up into his usual self. "What's the matter? Can't a doctor get sick once in a while?" I laughed, and suggested he do something about it, such as seeing his family physician. "I will," he said absently, then back up to his normal self, "but first, I'm going to Europe." I said that sounded fine. "Already have the tickets," he went on. "We've gone a number of times before, but this time I want to see a lot of the places we've missed. You ever been to Greece, or Turkey, Spain, Portugal, Egypt?" I said no. "Well, you ought to," he said, pushing his food away. "Go when you have the chance. You wouldn't want to miss seeing places like that." I'm not going to miss my chance. I said I would do my best, but that I didn't have a fat practice that would wait around for me to return. But he was serious again. Bob. I waited for him to continue. I don't like the way I feel, he said carefully. I don't like. Why don't you and your wife come to Europe with us? I wish we had. Dr. Gordon and his wife sailed to Spain a week or so later. There was no word, so I assumed they were sunning themselves somewhere in the Mediterranean. 6 weeks later, Mrs. Gordon phoned. The doctor had taken sick in Europe and they had to cut short their trip. He had refused treatment overseas, and had insisted that they return home instead. He had been in great pain, and had gone immediately into the hospital for an exploratory operation. I was unable to see him in the hospital, but I was kept informed of his condition by his wife. The exploratory operation was a success. They found what they were looking for, an abdominal cancer, beyond treatment. Nothing more could be done but to make him as comfortable as possible. He would never leave the hospital. Alive, that is. Or more aptly, physically alive. With this news, I felt I must find some way to see Dr. Gordon. It was all quite clear now, as most things are in retrospect. I am sure he knew of his condition that day in his office. After all, he was an internist. He certainly could have read the signs and symptoms in his own very personal laboratory. That was the reason for the sudden trip to Europe. He definitely wasn't going to miss his last chance, and he didn't. The need to talk with Dr. Gordon seemed urgent. In all of our conversations, I had never mentioned my wild talent, or what I had been going through. I think I was afraid he would have thrown back his head and laughed, then sent me to his psychiatrist son. Now it was different. He was facing something where perhaps I could help him for a change. I didn't know how what I had gone through could help, but I had a deep conviction that it would. I tried again and again to see Dr. Gordon, but only his wife was permitted in his room. I finally asked Mrs. Gordon to help me get in to see him. She explained that the doctor was in such pain that he was kept under deep sedation most of the time. Thus he was very rarely lucid and conscious. Usually he recognized her early in the morning, but even this didn't happen every day. I told her that I had something important to tell him. I didn't elaborate. Even in her sorrow, she seemed to recognize that I intended to bring a message beyond that of a comforting friend. The intuitive woman found a solution. "Why don't you write him a letter?" she suggested. "I'll take it to him." I said I was afraid he wouldn't be able to read it. "If you write it," she said, "I'll read it to him, when he's conscious enough to understand it." And so that was what we did. She read it again and again to Dr. Gordon whenever he was conscious. She told me later that these repeated readings were at his request, not at her suggestion. Was there something in the letter he wanted to place firmly in his mind? When I heard this, I felt a great sense of regret. Perhaps he would not have leaned back and laughed, after all. We might have shared much more if I had only gathered the courage to discuss my activities with him. Here are pertinent excerpts of the letter to Dr. Gordon. Quote ellipsis. "And you remember all the tests and examinations you gave me because you knew I was worried about something. Well, that was when it started. Now as long as you are in the hospital for a while, you might just try it and find out for yourself. That way, you don't have to take my word for it. It will give you something to do while you recuperate. First, you have to accept the possibility, remote as it may be to your experience, that you can act, think, and exist without the restriction of a physical body. And don't tell your wife to send me to that psychiatrist son of yours. It takes more than Freud to solve this one. Besides, he's making enough money as it is." In all of our conversations, it didn't seem appropriate to bring up this subject. But as long as you're going to be tied down, give it some serious consideration. It might be useful later on, and I hope you can discover a few things about it that I have passed over. It all depends upon whether you can also develop the ability to leave your physical body while loafing in that hospital bed. If so, you might find many ways that it can be helpful. It may be one way to ease physical pain. I don't know. Give it a try. Quote ellipsis. With all the sincerity I can muster, I urge you, Dick, to think about it. You will have passed a major milestone when you do no more than accept the idea that this second, non-physical body of yours actually might exist. Once this has been achieved, your only other barrier is fear. And it need not be. Because this is like being afraid of your shadow, of yourself. It is natural rather than strange. Get used to this idea, that your lack of conscious experience with it does not necessarily mean it is something to be afraid of. Unknowns are feared only as long as they remain so. If you can hang on to this, you need not have fear. Then, and only then, try the formula I have written here. I don't know the effect of any medication you may be taking. It may help or hinder the technique. But do give it a try. It may or may not work the first time. Quote ellipsis. Most important, let me know how you get along with it. When you get better, perhaps I can drop over and discuss the whole thing in detail. I would have come now in person, but you know how cranky the hospital is about rules. If you tell your wife about any attempts, I'm sure she will relay them to me. But I would much rather hear them from you later on. Just let me know. Ellipsis. Quote. Mrs. Gordon did not let me know if he actually did try. I felt it entirely inappropriate to query her too specifically at the time. She was much too sadly overwrought with the knowledge that Dr. Gordon's condition was terminal. I still am not sure that she realized my letter could be construed as suggested training for death. Dr. Gordon dropped into a coma several weeks later. He died peacefully without regaining consciousness. For several months I thought about an attempt to go to Dr. Gordon, wherever he was. He was the first person close to me who had died since the development of my wild talent. I was both curious and objective. It was the first such opportunity. I was sure that Dr. Gordon wouldn't mind, if he did continue to exist. Not knowing about such things, I decided he would probably need some rest before I interfered with whatever he was doing. Also, I needed to summon up some additional courage on my own. This was an experiment I hadn't tried before. It might be truly dangerous. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, I made the attempt. It took about an hour to get into the vibrational state, and I finally swung up out of the body mentally yelling, "I want to see Dr. Gordon." After a moment, I started to move rapidly upward, and soon all I could see was a blur of motion and feel what seemed like a rush of very thin air. Also, I felt a hand under my left elbow. Somebody was helping me get there. After what seemed an endless journey, I suddenly stopped or was halted. I was standing, somewhat dazed, in a large room. My impression was that it was an institution of some kind. The hand under my elbow moved me to an open doorway, and stopped me just inside the door, where I could look into the adjoining room. A male voice spoke almost directly into my left ear. "If you stand right here, the doctor will see you in a minute." I nodded agreement, and stood there waiting. A group of men were in the room. 3 or 4 were listening to a young man about 22 who was excitedly relating something to them, complete with gestures. I didn't see Dr. Gordon, and kept expecting him to appear at any moment. The more I waited, the warmer I seemed to feel. Finally, I became so hot that I was extremely uncomfortable. I didn't know what was causing me to feel so hot, and I wasn't sure I could stand it much longer. It actually felt as if streams of perspiration were running down my face. I knew that I couldn't stay much longer, I couldn't take the heat. If Dr. Gordon didn't appear soon, I would have to go back without seeing him. I turned and looked again at the group of men, thinking that perhaps I should ask them about Dr. Gordon. At just that moment, the short, thin young man with the big shock of hair stopped in the middle of his conversation, and looked at me intently for a moment. After the simple short glance, he turned back to the other men and continued his animated discussion. The heat became unbearable, and I decided I had to leave. I couldn't wait for Dr. Gordon. Using a motion I had learned, I moved quickly upward and away from the room. It was a long journey back. After reintegrating, I checked my physical body. I felt cold, a little stiff. Certainly there were no streams of perspiration running down my cheeks. Disappointed, I sat up and made notes of the trip. I had failed for some reason. I had not been able to find Dr. Gordon. Time away from the physical was 2 hours. There is a stubborn streak in my heredity. The following Saturday I tried again. Just at the moment I left the physical body and started to yell for Dr. Gordon, a voice spoke right beside me, almost irritated. "Why do you want to see him again? You saw him last Saturday." I was so surprised that I dropped back into the physical almost instantly. I sat up and looked around the office. There was no one in the room. Everything was normal. I thought of trying again, but decided it was too late for another attempt that day. Last Saturday. There was nothing important about last Saturday. It hadn't worked. I went back through my notes for last Saturday. And there it was. "The doctor will see you in a minute." And what could have been a minute later, a short, thin young man with a shock of hair had turned and looked at me intently. He had looked at me without saying a word, as if he were thinking. What I had noted was a perfect description of what Dr. Gordon would have been at 22 instead of 70. This seemed to lend more credence to the experience than anything else. I had expected to see a man of 70. I didn't recognize him because he was not what I expected. If I had suggested this as a hallucination, I conceivably would have met a 70-year-old Dr. Gordon. Later, at a visit to the home of Dr. Gordon's widow, I managed to see an old photo of Dr. Gordon when he was 22. Of course, I didn't tell Mrs. Gordon why I wanted to see the picture. It matched perfectly the man I saw, and who saw me, there. She also mentioned that at that age, he was very active and eager, always in a hurry, and had a big shock of blonde hair. Someday I will try again to visit Dr. Gordon. Another time, in anticipation of a move out of state, we sold our home when a buyer suddenly came along. As a temporary measure, we rented a house for the year prior to our move. It was an interesting place built on a pinnacle of rock directly over a small river. We rented it through an agent, and never met or came in contact with the owner. My wife and I took the master bedroom, which was on the main floor. About a week after we moved in, we went to bed and my wife fell asleep almost immediately. I lay there in semidarkness and looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the night sky. Without willing it, I felt the familiar vibrations begin, and wondered if it would be all right to let it happen in the new location. Our bed was positioned off the north wall. To the right of the bed, if you were lying down, was the door to the hall. To the left of the bed was the doorway into the master bathroom. I was just in the act of lifting out of the physical when I noticed something at the doorway. It was a white form the general size and shape of a person. Having become extremely cautious about strangers, I waited to see what would happen. The white form moved into the room, around the bed, and passed within a foot of my side of the bed as it went into the bathroom. I could see that it was a woman of medium height, with dark straight hair and rather deep-set eyes, not young, not old. She was in the bathroom only a few moments, then emerged and started around the bed again. I sat up, non-physically, I'm sure, and reached out to touch her, to see if I really could. Seeing the motion, she stopped and looked at me. When she spoke, I could hear her quite clearly. I could see the windows and drapes behind her and through her. "What are you going to do about the painting?" It was a woman's voice, and I could see her lips move. Not knowing what to say, I tried to give a satisfactory answer. I said I would take care of it, don't worry. With this, she smiled slightly. Then she reached out with both her hands and took my hand in hers, clasping my hand between both of hers. The hands felt real, normally warm and alive. She gave my hand a little squeeze, gently dropped it, and moved around the bed and out the door. I waited, but she didn't return. I lay down, activated the physical, then slid out of bed. I went to the hall door and looked into the other rooms. There was no one there. I went through all of the downstairs rooms and found nothing. Then I made out my notes, went back to bed, and slept. A few days later I met the psychiatrist who lived in the house next to us, Dr. Samuel Kahn. I kept meeting psychiatrists this casually. I asked him if he had known the people who owned our house. Yes, yes, I knew them quite well, Dr. Khan said. Mrs. W. died about a year ago. After that, Mr. W. refused to go into the house, just moved out and didn't come back. I said it was too bad, that it was a fine house. Well, it was her house, you understand, Dr. Khan replied. Matter of fact, she died right there in the house, in the room you're sleeping in. I said that was interesting. She must have liked the house very much. Oh, she did, he replied. Very fond of paintings. Had them hung all over the place. But the house was pretty much her whole life. I asked him if he happened to have a photo of Mrs. W. Let me see. He thought for a moment. Why, yes. I think she was in on a group picture taken at the club. I'll see if I can find it. Dr. Khan came back a few minutes later. In his hand was a photograph showing some 50 or 60 men and women, most of them simply heads as they stood in rows. Dr. Khan studied the picture. She's in here somewhere, yes, I'm sure. I looked over his shoulder at the picture. In the second row was a familiar face. I touched it with my finger and asked Dr. Khan if this was Mrs. W. Oh yes, yes, that's Mrs. W. He looked at me curiously, then with realization. Oh, you must have found a picture of her in the house somewhere. I said yes, that was it. Very casually, I asked him if Mrs. W. had had any unusual mannerisms or the like. No, not that I can remember, he answered. But I'll think about it. There must have been something. I thanked him, and started to leave. I turned when he called. Wait a minute, there was one item, Dr. Khan said. I asked what it was. Why, whenever she was happy or grateful, she took your hand in both of hers, palm to palm, and gave a little squeeze. Does that help? That helped. With experience, I became a little more convinced that I could take such chances in areas that were certainly unusual. A very close friend, Agnew Bonson, was about my age and we had much in common. I had known him for about 8 years. He was a pilot, among other things, and flew frequently in his company airplane. One of his research interests was anti-gravity, which we discussed many times. He had a laboratory where he conducted experiments in this field. Among matters we discussed relative to his gravity studies was the question of how one or even two people could demonstrate any effective results in anti-gravity in this age of massive research teams and extremely expensive instrumentation. On a business trip to New York in 1964, I found myself in my hotel room with an hour to spare in the afternoon. I decided to take a nap. I lay down on the bed, and had just started to drop off to sleep when I heard Mr. Bonson's voice. There is a way to prove anti-gravity. All you have to do is to demonstrate it yourself, and you have been trained to do it. I sat up, fully awake. I knew what the voice was referring to, but I hadn't had the courage to try it. But why did Mr. Bonson's voice sound so real in this dream? I looked at the clock by the bed, and it was just about 3:15. I was too wide awake now to sleep, so I got up and went out. When I returned home 2 days later, my wife was very quiet. I asked her what was wrong. We didn't want to upset you with all you had to do in New York, she said, but Agnew Bonson is dead. He was killed trying to land his airplane in a small field out in Ohio. I remembered Mr. Bonson's voice in New York. I asked her if he had been killed 2 days ago, at about 3:15 in the afternoon. My wife looked at me a long time before she said, yes. That was when it happened. She didn't ask how I knew. She was past that long ago. I didn't make any attempt to go to Mr. Bonson for several months. I presumed without any known reason that he needed rest. It had something to do with a violent death, and I'm still not sure I was right. Finally, I grew impatient. On Sunday afternoon I lay down with the deliberate intent of going to visit Mr. Bonson. After about an hour of preparation, I finally made it out of the physical, and began to travel rapidly through what seemed to be nothing but darkness. I was mentally shouting, Agnew Bonson, again and again as I traveled. Suddenly, I stopped, or was stopped. I was in a rather dark room. Someone was holding me very still in a standing position. After a moment of waiting, a cloud of white gas seemed to blow up through a small hole in the floor. The cloud took form and some sense told me it was Mr. Bonson, although I could not see him too well or identify his features. He spoke immediately in an excited and happy way. "Bob, you'll never believe all of the things that have happened since I've been here." There was no more. At a signal from someone, the cloud of white gas lost its human form and seemed to recede back into the hole in the floor. The hands on my elbows steered me away, and I took off back to the physical. That is the way Mr. Bonson would have been, too interested in new things and new experiences to waste time in the then, or the past, just like Dr. Gordon. If it was a self-induced hallucination, at least it was original. I have never read anything like it. Does that explain the time coincidence in the New York hotel room? There is one more. In 1964 my father died at the age of 82. Although I had been rebellious in early years against paternal authority, I felt quite close to my father in later years. And I'm sure he felt close to me. He had suffered a stroke several months before, which had left him almost completely paralyzed and incapable of speech. The latter was evidently most vexing, as it would naturally be to a man who was a linguist, whose life had been devoted to the study and teaching of languages. During this period, when I visited him, he made desperate, heart-rending attempts to speak to me, to tell me something. His eyes pleaded that I understand. Only slight moans came from his lips. I tried to comfort him, talk to him. He tried his best to answer. I couldn't tell if he even understood my words. My father died quietly in his sleep one afternoon. He had lived a full life, a successful one, and his death brought mingled sadness and a sense of release. Again and again, I have realized the importance of some of the down-to-earth beliefs and concepts that I learned from my father. I will always be grateful. This time, with one very close to me just recently dead, I had much less trepidation than before. Or perhaps familiarity, at least the sense of it, bred a little less caution and more faith. The only reason that I waited several months was one of convenience. Other pressing matters in my personal and business life seemed to prevent the necessary ability to relax. However, I woke up at about 3 a.m. on a weeknight and felt that I could try to visit my father. I went through my ritual, and the vibrations came easily and swiftly. In moments, I disengaged without effort, and was up and free in the darkness. This time, I didn't use the mental yell. I concentrated upon the personality of my father and reached to be where he was. I began to move rapidly through the darkness. I could see nothing, but there was the tremendous sense of motion coupled with the pull of thick, liquid-like air rushing past my body. It is much like the feeling of plunging through water after a dive. Suddenly, I stopped. I do not recall anyone stopping me this time, nor could I feel the hand on my elbow. I was in a dim room of large proportions. I seemed to know that this was like a hospital or convalescent home, but no treatment as we know it was practiced here. I started to look around for my father. I didn't know what to expect, but at least I looked forward to a joyful reunion. There were several small rooms off the main room where I stood. I looked into two of these, and in each there were several people who paid little attention to me. I began to wonder if I had come to the wrong place. The third room was no larger than a monk's cell, with a small window about shoulder height in the wall opposite the door. There was a man leaning against the wall near the window, looking out. I saw only his back as I entered. Then he turned and saw me. His face registered utter astonishment, and my dead father spoke to me. "What are you doing here?" He said this in exactly the manner a person would use who had traveled halfway around the world and then met someone to whom he had just said goodbye back home. I was too excited to speak, and just stood there, hoping for the joyful reunion I had expected. It came immediately. My father reached forward, grabbed me under the armpits, and happily swung me high over his head and down again, just as I remembered so well as a small child, just as most fathers have done with their small sons. He put me down on my feet again, and I was confident enough to speak. I asked him how he was feeling. "Much better now," he said. "The pain is gone." It was almost as if I had reminded him of something he wanted to forget. The energy seemed to drain out of him, and he turned away, appearing tired. As I watched him, he seemed to forget I was there. He looked thinner and about 50, based upon pictures we have when he was that age. I sensed that the meeting was over. There could be no more for now. Quietly, I moved back out of the room, turned and reached out, and returned to the physical body. It took much less time to return than to go. Was it that way? Was the pain so intense in those last days when he couldn't make himself understood to get help to ease that pain? If that is true, what a terrible prison his body must have been. Death was indeed a blessing. Will I try to see him again? I don't know. I don't know if I should. There are many other experiences, less personal, but equally impressive. They all led me to an inescapable empirical conclusion, which alone justified the many, many hours of anguish, uncertainty, fear, loneliness, and disillusion, which was a point of embarkation on what some call the quantum jump in thinking and the beginning of a new viewpoint and perspective, which permitted the pains and pleasures of here now to drop into their proper category of importance. What is a minute, hour, or year in an infinity of existence? Which opened a doorway to a reality that may ultimately prove incomprehensible to the conscious human mind. Yet will continue to tantalize the curious and incriminate the intellectual. Is this my answer? Compound these experiences with the knowledge that the human personality can and does operate away from the physical body, and there can be but one. If there is to be a great message herein, this may suffice. 8. 'Cause the Bible tells me so. If the human being has a second body, if that second body survives what we call death, if personality and character continue to exist in this new old form, what then? Again, an age-old question that pleads for an answer. To date, in 12 years of non-physical activities, I find no evidence to substantiate the biblical notions of God and afterlife in a place called heaven. Perhaps I have found this and simply haven't recognized it. It is quite possible. It may be that I am not qualified. On the other hand, much of what I have encountered could be some basics which have been distorted through hundreds of years. Let's start with prayer, which is supposed to be a direct communication with God. As we are taught to pray today, it is as if a chemical formula is recited without any knowledge of the original intent or meaning of the ingredients. Or the way our children sing, "London Bridge is falling down," with no knowledge of the original meaning of the song. Our entire civilization is filled with such irrational habits. Evidently, prayer is one of these. Somewhere, someone knew how to pray. He tried to teach others. A few learned the methodology. Others absorbed only the words, and the words themselves became altered and changed over the years. Gradually, the technique was lost, until accidentally rediscovered periodically through the ages. In the latter cases, only rarely has the rediscoverer been able to convince others that the old, established way is not quite right. This is all I can report. The old, established way is not enough. Or as I say, perhaps I am not qualified. Worse still, it may be that my prayer training was insufficient or improper. At any rate, it didn't work for me. Here is an illustration. On one non-physical excursion, I was speeding through nothing back to the physical with everything apparently well under control. Without warning, I rammed into a solid wall of some impenetrable material. I wasn't hurt, but I was utterly shocked. The material was hard and solid, and seemed to be made of huge plates of steel overlapping slightly and welded together. Each had a slight curvature as if part of a globe. I tried to push through it, but could not. I went up, down, to the right, and to the left. I was absolutely sure my physical body lay beyond this barrier. After what seemed an hour of scratching, clawing, and pushing at this barrier, I prayed. I used every prayer I had ever learned, and made up a few special ones. And I meant every word more than I had ever meant anything in my life. I was that frightened. Nothing happened. I was still plastered against the barrier, unable to get through and back to my physical body. I panicked. I clawed, screamed, and sobbed. After this proved futile, I finally calmed down only out of emotional exhaustion. Feeling lost, I lay there and rested, clinging to the cold, hard wall. I don't know how long I lay there until the ability to think objectively returned. But it did. I couldn't stay there forever, or at least I didn't want to. It seemed an impossible situation. Where before had I encountered an apparently impossible situation? I remembered. Years before, a friend and I had purchased an airplane whose flight characteristics we did not know. The only reason we bought this particular plane was that it was cheap and in good condition. After several practice flights around the field, we decided to take it up for acrobatics. With borrowed parachutes, we took off and headed up to around 10,000 feet. We took it through several lazy eights, a few sloppy loops, and several spins. Everything seemed all right. After climbing back to altitude, we nosed the ship down slightly and popped stick and rudder to go into a snap roll. The next thing we knew, we were in a spin. We centered stick, and forward, the accepted recovery procedure. It had worked before beautifully. But not this time. The spin became flatter, faster, and was developing a whip-like action. Opposite rudder against the spin, bursts of power, none had any effect on the spin. If anything, the spin worsened and the ground was coming up fast. Bill looked around from the front cockpit, his face white. He yelled at me over the wind roar, "We'd better get out of here." I was ready to leave too. The only thing that kept me there a few more seconds was the possible loss of the airplane for which I had saved so long. I reasoned, we've tried everything except the procedure that violates the rules, the one thing not to do if you're in a spin. Pull back on the stick. What did I have to lose? I pulled back on the stick. The ship straightened out of the spin immediately and gathered flying speed. I rolled it until the earth was where it belonged. We landed safely and crawled out shakily and sat on the ground. We had fallen into an outside spin. Neither of us had seen such a spin before, much less tried one. I remember the outside spin. I tried to apply the concept as I lay there panting against the barrier. Forward, up, down, right, left, no good. There was just one remaining direction, although my knowledge said definitely it was not right. It couldn't make things any worse to try, so I did, and only a few moments later, I was back in the physical shaken but safe. Which way? It was obvious in hindsight, away from the barrier, back in the direction from which I had been traveling. Why this worked, I don't know. Nor do I know what the barrier was. Perhaps it could be rationalized that prayer did work. I did get back, didn't I? If it did, it was not in the manner that religion taught me. No helping angel came hurrying to give me aid and comfort. Another time, I was visiting my brother and his family overnight. Shortly after retiring to the guest room, I went to bed for some much-needed rest. If it has any bearing, the headboard of my bed backed against the wall separating my room from that of my 4-year-old niece. Her bed was directly against the same wall. As I stretched out in the dark, the familiar surge of vibrations came, and I decided to slip out for a moment just to test being in this condition away from home. The moment I left the physical, I became aware of 3 beings in the room. I stayed cautiously close to my physical body as they came nearer. They started to pull at me, not hard, but deliberately as if to see what I would do. They were having a good time at it. I tried to stay calm, but there were 3 of them. I wasn't sure I could get back into the physical quickly enough before they pulled me away. So I prayed. Again, I used every prayer I knew. I asked God to help me. I prayed in the name of Jesus Christ for help. I tried a few saints I had heard of through my Catholic wife. The result? My tormentors laughed loudly and worked me over more enthusiastically. Listen to him pray to his gods, one chuckled, most contemptuously. Listen to him. I think I got a little angry after that. I began to push back, got close to my physical body, and dove in. I wasn't exactly fighting back, but I certainly didn't remain passive. I sat up in the physical, most relieved to be back. Even as I sat up, I heard a child crying. It was coming from the room beyond the wall. I waited several minutes, expecting my sister-in-law to come and calm the little girl and get her back to sleep. After some 10 minutes, the little girl, Jay, still had not stopped. I got up and went out to the adjoining bedroom. My sister-in-law had the little girl, who was still sobbing deeply, in her arms and was trying to comfort her. I asked what was wrong, and could I help. "She'll be all right in a little while, I think," my sister-in-law replied. "She must have had a nightmare or bad dream, and I can't seem to wake her up." I asked how long the girl had been crying. "Oh, just a few minutes before you came in. She isn't like this. She usually sleeps very soundly." I offered again to help if needed, and went back to my room. Some time later little Jay quieted down and evidently went to sleep. Was my niece's trance-like nightmare a coincidence? Or perhaps some new praying technique is needed on my part? There are many more such incidents, but they followed much the same pattern when I attempted the conventional and accepted approach to prayer. There are, however, more positive prospects to report regarding heaven and hell. If they exist, they are somewhere in Locale 2. In non-physical trips to Locale 2, often there is a layer, or area which one must pass through, as mentioned earlier. It seems to be the part of Locale 2 closest to here now, and in some way most related. It is a gray-black hungry ocean where the slightest motion attracts nibbling and tormenting beings. It is as if you are the bait dangling in this vast sea. If you move slowly and do not react to the curious fish who come to investigate, you pass through without much incident. Move violently and fight back, then more excited denizens come rushing in to bite, pull, push, shove. Could this be the borders of hell? It is easy to conclude that a momentary penetration of this nearby layer would bring demons and devils to mind as the chief inhabitants. They seem subhuman, yet have an evident ability to act and think independently. Who and what are they? I don't know. I haven't taken the trouble to stay there long enough to find out. Only by terrified trial and error did I find the method to pass through in reasonable peace. In these worlds where thoughts are not only things, but are everything, including you, your poison or perfection is of your own making. If you are a remorseless killer, you may end up in that part of Locale 2 where all are of the same design. This truly would be hell for such people, for there would be no innocent, defenseless victims. Project this outward, and you can begin to perceive the myriad variations. Your destination in the heaven or hell of Locale 2 seems to be grounded completely within the framework of your deepest constant and perhaps non-conscious motivations, emotions, and personality drives. The most consistent and strongest of these act as your homing device when you enter this realm. I am sure of this because it always works this way when I have traveled non-physically in Locale 2. It works this way whether I want it to or not. The least stray desire at the wrong time, or a deep-seated emotion I wasn't aware of, diverts my trip in that, direction. Some of the resulting destinations have had all the aspects of hell to me. Others might possibly be construed as heaven, and some differ in practice only slightly from our activities in here now. So, if Locale 2 seems to have portions of hell and doesn't quite live up to our notions of heaven, what then? Where do we look for the guidepost? Where are the God and heaven that we worship? Have I missed something? And yet, at times, in visiting Locale 2, a very unusual event periodically occurs. It makes no difference where in Locale 2, the event is the same. In the midst of normal activity, whatever it may be, there is a distant signal, almost like heraldic trumpets. Everyone takes the signal calmly, and with it, everyone stops speaking or whatever he may be doing. It is the signal that he or they is coming through his kingdom. There is no awestruck prostration or falling down on one's knees. Rather, the attitude is most matter of fact. It is an occurrence to which all are accustomed and to comply takes absolute precedence over everything. There are no exceptions. At the signal, each living thing lies down. My impression is on their backs, bodies arched to expose the abdomen, not the genitals, with head turned to one side so that one does not see him as he passes by. The purpose seems to be to form a living road over which he can travel. I have gleaned the idea that occasionally he will select someone from this living bridge, and that person is never seen or heard from again. The purpose of the abdominal exposure is an expression of faith and complete submissiveness, the abdomen being the most vulnerable part of the body or the area that can suffer damage most easily. There is no movement, not even thought, as he passes by. Everything has come to a momentary standstill, full and complete, while he passes. In the several times that I have experienced this, I lay down with the others. At the time, the thought of doing otherwise was inconceivable. As he passes, there is a roaring musical sound and a feeling of radiant, irresistible living force of ultimate power that peaks overhead and fades in the distance. I remember wondering once what would happen to me if he discovered my presence, as a temporary visitor. I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. After his passing, everyone gets up again and resumes their activities. There is no comment or mention of the incident, no further thought of it. There is complete acceptance of the event as an ordinary part of their lives, and this is the great yet subtle difference. It is an action as casual as halting for a traffic light at a busy intersection, or waiting at the railroad crossing when the signal indicates that a train is coming. You are unconcerned and yet feel unspoken respect for the power represented in the passing train. The event is also impersonal. Is this God, or God's Son, or his representative? 3 times I have gone to a place that I cannot find words to describe accurately. Again, it is this vision, this interpretation, the temporary visitation to this place, or state of being that brings the message we have heard so often throughout the history of man. I am sure that this may be part of the ultimate heaven as our religions conceive it. It must also be the nirvana, the samadhi, the supreme experience related to us by the mystics of the ages. It is truly a state of being, very likely interpreted by the individual in many different ways. To me, it was a place or condition of pure peace, yet exquisite emotion. It was as if you were floating in warm soft clouds where there is no up or down, where nothing exists as a separate piece of matter. The warmth is not merely around you, it is of you and through you. Your perception is dazzled and overwhelmed by the perfect environment. The cloud in which you float is swept by rays of light in shapes and hues that are constantly changing, and each as good as you bathe in them as they pass over you. Ruby red rays of light, or something beyond what we know as light, because no light ever felt this meaningful. All the colors of the spectrum come and go constantly, never harshly, and each brings a different soothing or restful happiness. It is as if you are within and a part of the clouds surrounding an eternally glowing sunset, and with every changing pattern of living color, you also change. You respond and drink into you the eternity of the blues, yellows, greens, and reds, and the complexities of the intermediates. All are familiar to you. This is where you belong. This is home. As you move slowly and effortlessly through the cloud, there is music around you. It is not something of which you become aware. It is there all the time, and you vibrate in harmony with the music. Again, this is more than the music you knew back there. It is only those harmonies, the delicate and dynamic melodic passages, the multivoiced counterpoint, the poignant overtones, it is only those that have evoked in you the deep, incoherent emotion back there. The mundane is missing. Choirs of human-sounding voices echo in wordless song. Infinite patterns of strings in all shades of subtle harmony interweave in cyclical yet developing themes, and you resonate with them. There is no source from which the music comes. It is there, all around you, in you, you are a part of it, and it is you. It is the purity of a truth of which you have had only a glimpse. This is the feast, and the tiny tidbits you tasted before, back there, had made you hope for the existence of the whole. The nameless emotion, longing, nostalgia, sense of destiny that you felt back there when you stared at the cloud-layered sunset in Hawaii, when you stood quietly among the tall, waving trees in the silent forest, when a musical selection, passage, or song recalled memories of the past or brought forth a longing for which there was no associated memory, when you longed for the place where you belonged, whether city, town, country, nation, or family, these are now fulfilled. You are home. You are where you belong. Where you always should have been.